Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second annual Johnston Coastal Sustainability Symposium. It's wonderful to see so many folks here and get such a response from the crowd. I think, this is a tradition now. It's only the second year, but I feel a lot of momentum, and it's really exciting to bring folks in who work in this field to Baldhead. The Conservancy, we try and help the village and help the islanders as much as we can understand about what's happening around us. But it's really through these connections that we make with our academic partners and partners through a wide range of fields, and then bring you directly connected with them. I think it makes all the difference in the world. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be interesting. There will be a little time for questions. We'll have to see how it progresses. So I don't forget. For those that are going to the dinner tonight, if you do not get to ask your question today, our speakers have said, feel free to approach them tonight at the club. So you may have a lot of questions, but they're more than willing to do that. So thank you very much. And before we get started, thank you, Pat and Dick. They are the ones that they're the energy behind making this happen, and it's really wonderful to work with them on this endeavor. Dick, you wanted to stand up and say a word to.
Thank you. It's fun, and thank you for coming out. A lot of friends in this audience, and we appreciate all of you and the few that are coming out. And I'd like to really thank the panel. Minds, scientific outlook that we're going to maybe particularly the ones that are back for the second door. Kostka is from a great educational Georgia Institute of Technology. And his wife, Ollie Mitchell, is here. Thank you, Kat. What I'm doing without
The one thing about Pat does, she knows how to pick out shirts for him to wear.
The rest of the panel, they did pretty well, but they obviously didn't pay attention to the memo. Chris McCall is here. Chris is back for the second year to join the panel. Joe Long is back again, and we really appreciate that. We got some new talent that weren't able to be with us, including our speaker this evening. He and his wife have been our guests for a few days, and it's been fun to get to know Craig, Landry, and his wife, and two fine children. So I think they enjoy all of this. And here, there. It's not good. Yeah. Well, you're not speaking to your group this morning. No, just taking that. So thank you all for coming. And I'll just put in one plug since Chris has got a search going for the development director now. And come up with another excellent one for that. I just wanted to mention there's still some mapping money available for those that might want to contact us or even maybe help with that. We would welcome your support. And hopefully we're kind of proving learning on spurs. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say that Dick and Pat have graciously made another nice very gift that we're going to use for an endowment for the sustainability initiatives going forward. So just wonderful. I hope we're making you confident in the process. So thank you. So a few other thank yous. BHA, Carrie, thank you for BHA for hosting this. It's a lovely venue to have it. Thank you very much. The club for hosting tonight's dinner. It's nice of them to allow us to use their facility. They're a lot better at cooking than we are, the Conservancy. Although Desi can give them a run for their money. The village, just for supporting us. Peter, I just want to recognize Peter, and I think I saw Scott here too. But yeah, Peter.
I just want to make a comment. Whenever we're dealing with anything with the village, there's times that we reach out to the public for their opinion. One of the things that comes back every single time is searching for how the village community, this kind of nature, and the fact that we can pull this on annually now is fantastic, and it just reflects what we're really about. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We appreciate it. The inn for hosting our invited guests. That's a nice. Gail and Dan are great. All of our invited speakers for agreeing to do this. We, obviously the contribution you're making to the Conservancy end of the island is really valuable, and we appreciate it. And my team, there's a lot that they put into making all the preparations for this, and it's just an unbelievable group of people, and I appreciate all the help they provide. And of course, all of you, thanks for coming and enjoying the afternoon and this morning. So I will say some of the conversations today might be a little uncomfortable in terms of the nature of the world around us and in the environment and what's happening with it. So we need to be able to address that and go, you can't live under a shell, say nothing ever, bald head will be here for the next 10 million years. Well, probably not, but we can do our best to make it last as long as we possibly can in a healthy environment as long as we can. So we're going to have some good conversations, and I appreciate you all partaking in that. All right. Just a little background, the purpose of the Sustainability Center, identify and pursue sustainability projects. We're getting underway with some of the projects this year, hopefully a living shoreline, which we'll hear a little bit about, maybe some sea level rise gauges in the marsh, establish a network, right? The Conservancy, we have a great crew of scientists, but we're a small group, right? We have to work with our outside partners who have the expertise in these fields. And this is really important to engage with the public, which is what we're doing today. It doesn't do us any good, but learn as much as we can to try and get initiatives going and not have the public know about it or buy into it. So the more we can communicate and engage with you, the better this will be for all of us. So what is sustainability? We're going to have a little presentation later on about how hard this is to define. Well, last year, Dylan had this definition. Sustainability is a dynamical characteristic whereby a linked human environmental system remains stable under exogenous disturbance. That's a lot, right? But I think it kind of aptly describes what the Conservancy is talking about. How do you we're here, we have an influence on nature. How do we balance the future when you have those competing interests? It's a really challenging situation, and how do you make them stable in the long run? And that's a whole nother, we'll get into that some of the time frames. There you go, Dylan, 2021. Maybe he'll change it, I don't know, that was 2 years ago. Just some of the activities updates, some pilot projects at living shoreline and sea level gauges. You'll hear a little bit about living shorelines in a little bit. The conversations have begun. I love when I start hearing these, extemporaneously outside, asking questions. It's great. And we awarded the very first graduate fellowship in coastal sustainability. Announcement, drum roll, Kimmy Hansen from UNC Chapel Hill. Yeah. So her project title, Build Out Analysis of Bald Head Island, Scenario Analysis of the Impacts of New Development and Zoning on BHI's Maritime Forests. I think this is an incredibly timely project, and we had an open application process, and we had a review process, and then we followed up with some questions for her and her advisor, Todd Vendor at Chapel Hill. And she was really engaged and really on it. And a lot of this will also include interviews with stakeholders. So I think it's going to be a really comprehensive project. Should be a lot of fun. So yeah, she will start this summer. And she's getting her master's in city and regional planning. So. All right, let's get started. Let me get our and play. Is that it? Was that not it? Oh, went at the beginning.
There we go.
There we go.
I forgot one thing.
Yeah.
We're just gonna thank your speaker here, who was our speaker last. Dylan did a fantastic job, and we appreciate you coming back. That people may not know, every now and then, after so many years, the academics can get some time off, and he is right in the middle of that time off, and still got a few things he's keeping his hand in. He's come back from that, and he and his wife, he was telling me last night, are leaving tonight for surfing and trip to Europe. from ILM tonight, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah. So although I'm leaving I'm on sabbatical this semester. This is the only official work thing I've done all semester, so. there you go.
Dylan McNamara, UNCW.
See, I want to echo Chris's thanks to particularly Dick and Pat. By the way, 4 minutes. You took 4 of my minutes.
You got it.
But I just want to echo Chris and say thanks to Dick and Pat real quick. It's been a pleasure to get to know them. This has been wonderful, but it's been really a pleasure just to get to know them. So I'm going to do my best to make you all uncomfortable right out of the gate. Because I'm on sabbatical, I kind of took the easy way out for my talk. I recently published a review paper. So the title of my talk is the title of that review paper. I'm just going to take you through the review paper. And getting invited to write a review paper is a clear signal that you're sort of at the halfway point or beyond of your career. It's kind of like I was thinking about last night watching the basketball game. I'm like a studio analyst now. They want me to comment more than they want me in the action. So I'm going to take you through the review paper. And what I actually did in the review paper was, rather than look backwards and kind of review the literature, I took more of a forward look, and in a true academic style, rather than say anything definitive, I just posed questions and didn't even answer the questions, just answered them with even more questions. So I'm going to give you all a sense of the kinds of questions that I think are critical things to be thinking about. The review article was related to populated coastal systems writ large. What do we currently know, or what can I ask about the future of research into areas with a lot of human beings living right along the coast? So the best way to start is, I'll just show you my abstract. The shortest abstract I've ever written in my career. It's 2 sentences. And so I'm going to read it, and then I'm just going to pick apart some of the jargony stuff, and we're going to dive in a little bit to understand some of these pieces. So given the inevitability of sea level rise, investigating processes of human-altered coastlines at the intermediate timescales of years to decades can sometimes feel like an exercise in futility. It's a little bit morose. I'll tell you why I say that. Returning to the big picture and long view of feedbacks, emergent dynamics, and wider context, here we offer 10 existential questions for research into human coastal coupled systems. So I won't go through all 10 questions that it takes. I'm just going to pick a couple of them. And the first thing I want to do to kind of pick apart some of this jargon is to talk about what I mean when I say in the title and in the abstract, human coastal coupled systems. That word coupling has very specific meaning in my world of math and physics. It is telling you something very important about that system. And in particular, on the timescales that I think most people in this audience are interested in, you have to consider what this coupling business means. And that timescale is years to sort of decades. We know a good deal about processes at the coastline that we would call natural. So we have mathematical relationships, empirical understanding, theoretical understanding of things like how sand moves around. More or less. Storms come, erosion happens, accretion happens, waves move sand up and down the beach. Sometimes storms come and dump sand on the top of the beach. We don't have like prediction level accuracy on the year time scale of where that sand is going to go, but we know the essence of those processes. We also have a pretty good amount of understanding of market processes, how economic systems work, supply, demand, assets, what gives an asset value, yada, yada, yada. Along the coastline, if you want to study and understand the dynamics of that system on years to decades, you can't just know those processes. You can't just know those processes. And historically, what a lot of people did, physical scientists would take the economics as a perturbation into their system, or vice versa. The economists would think about the physical thing as just being a whack, a perturbation in their system. But that's not good enough. You have to consider the fact that these two batches of processes influence each other. So they're coupled, which is a way to say that they influence each other. So the natural processes influence the economic system, damage being the obvious way. Storms come and they impact assets, change values. Those things happen. And then the economic system churns and influences the natural processes. Beach nourishment being the most obvious example, building of dunes. And so that sand is moving around, not just because of, I like to say, not just because of Newton, But Adam Smith also, sand is moving around because dollars are saying, move that sand from here to here. So if you want to ask what's going to happen to these coastal coupled human systems on years to decades, you have to wrap all of these things into your model or to your investigation of particular data. So this is the point me and a colleague made 15 years ago in a paper. And so now this futility business, let me talk about that. So all the things I'm going to show you, some of the plots I'll show you are from work that I've done where I'm not going to explicitly say it every time, but all of the stuff I've done has all those ingredients in it. Economics, physics, damage, mitigation, all those things. So we started this is the first sentence of the paper. We all know how this ends. That's pretty sad. Once sea level is a meter or more above its current height, many human altered low-lying coastal systems globally will manifest economic and physical configurations that are fundamentally different from their current states. That's important. And if you don't believe me, I'll just show one example of why I'm able to say something that definitive. This is work some colleagues of mine did, where they looked at coastlines, all that you see here, Gulf Coast, Florida, the entire Atlantic seaboard, barrier islands, colored blue and dark blue. Let's focus on the lighter blue. Those are locations that have more than 100 nodes. And what a node is they looked at road networks. And a node is defined as a place where two road networks intersect, so an intersection. So all of the light blue places have more than 100 effectively intersections of their road networks. So you just get a spatial snapshot of those blue areas. And then I'll just show you what the elevation of those nodes is relative to mean sea level. And this is the distribution of those elevations, which is in that paper. So that's meters on the horizontal axis, the number of nodes in the thousands on the vertical axis. So the takeaway here is that most of those light blue places have roads that are less than 2 meters above mean sea level. Many of them are half meter, a meter, meter and a half above mean sea level. That's mean sea level. That's not high tide. And many, many other things. I'm not going to go into the weeds with this, but that's low. Sea level's rising. Just through one IPCC look at rising sea level. And I don't want to get into the details of the numbers. We have an expert here who can do that for us. She did it last year. One of the important points that Dr. Mitchell made was that the variability, the temporal variability of that signal is significant. In other words, when you see these curves that are rising like this, that's just like a global average and a smoothed out version through time. There's actually huge wiggles there. So some places can be on the top of a wiggle that can swamp the rise that they're going to see in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So the temporal signal is important. The spatial signal is really important. We're in a local area of a hotspot of sea level rise. As Gulf Stream changes, blah, blah, blah. There's changes that happen in space on fairly small spatial scales where you can have much more sea level rise in one place than you can in somewhere else that's just a handful of miles up the road. So the takeaway here, and I can say this with scientific certainty. So with a physics background, we would like to work in orders of magnitude. I can tell you that in a year, 10 years here, everything's gonna be okay. And I say mostly because there are plenty of places not too far from here where even in 10 years, things are not gonna be okay. Things aren't okay right now. Norfolk, Virginia is dealing with all kinds of issues already. But here, Bald Head, 10 years, things will be cool. 100 years, things will not. There will be serious problems. And so those road networks, we don't just want, it's not just a problem the moment the water gets over the road. There's plenty of infrastructure underneath the road. And as that sits in the water every single day, that's going to cause significant problems. When you start to cut up transportation networks, people can't get to work, people can't get to school, can't get revenue for your Airbnb, whatever the case might be. These systems are going to change dramatically at some point in the next 100 years. Can't tell you exactly when. But it's wonderful that science has been able to do that for us. That we have even any idea that this is coming, and it's coming. So now we can get to the questions. First one's a bit of a scientific sort of question, but I'm going to pick out a lesson from this that I think speaks to some of the things I was just saying. What emergent dynamics have resulted from strong coupling between human activities and physical processes at the coast? So that's a little jargon speak. Let me tell you what I mean when I say emergent dynamics. That is a scientific term that has to do with when you have systems that have a lot of interacting pieces and they're interacting in fairly complicated ways. If you take a larger spatial and temporal view, the system can do things that seem disconnected from the micro rules that are happening. A classic example is a flock of birds. These birds, when we all agree, we look at that structure there is pretty fantastic, and it seems to have its own spatial scale, and the way it behaves in time is its own time scale. That's totally independent of the interaction of the birds with their neighbor birds. They're just following little rules. My neighbor bird's doing this, I'm going to do this, and they kind of just jostle around. And then when you pile all that stuff up, you get this behavior that emerges out that seems like a super behavior for that system. So for the coastal system, we have a lot of interacting things: sand, economics, people, towns, and you put all those things into a mathematical model and ask the question, is there some superstructure that comes out? Are there any characteristics that pop out of that that are sort of characteristics that are disconnected from the fundamental interactions? And I'll just show you one that I published many years ago. And I put in red what these axes are in sort of lay speak. So what I'm looking at here is I took a mathematical model that had all the sort of sand moving around and all the natural processes with no human beings in it whatsoever. And I measured how much the barrier island in that case, in the natural barrier island case, how much it gets kind of jiggled around, eroded, sands landing on top, things like that, how much it's getting sort of shaken, you think of it. And I measured that as a function of how often that happens. So this is frequency. So over on this side, the jiggling around in the black, or sorry, the gray, it's getting jiggled, but not as much as it gets jiggled at really low frequencies. Those are just big storms. When big storms come, it really rattles the barrier island. The day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month storms that come, they're not sort of wiggling around quite as much. That's to be expected. When you put human beings in the system, profit maximizing, beach nourishing, condo building, human beings onto the barrier island, and you do the same exact experiment mathematically, what you find out is that humans do a pretty good job at filtering out the jiggling that happens on high frequencies. So we protect ourselves from the smaller storms, build up dunes, do beach nourishment, and it helps the barrier island not jiggle around quite as much at high frequencies. But we pay for that dramatically in the jiggling around that happens at low frequencies. When the big storms do finally come and overwhelm the systems, the barrier island gets whacked way harder than it would if it had been left in its natural state. And this kind of a feature is common in a lot of other human environmental systems. River floodplains, building along rivers, you do the same thing. You put up levees to protect yourself from small floods. You do that, you're good on the small floods, but every once in a while, huge floods come. And when they do, it's a catastrophe. So the same thing happens in barrier islands. So the emergence in this case is this emergence of large, low frequency disasters. And we make the point in this paper, we're sort of stuck in this. This is just the existence of living on barrier islands. Big, large storms happening infrequently, and when they do happen, it's a big problem. So then, given that that's the case, why do events that should warn us about the future and offer a chance to reset lead to decisions that increase fragility? So you would think, we know this is happening, why don't we just deal with it and start to make changes that get us out of this trap? So I've done plenty of work, and some of it's ongoing, and maybe Greg, Dr. Landry will talk about some of it tonight that we're working on together, where we are looking at all of the things that go into this question. Why is the fragility increasing? And so in previous work, when I put all these things in again, economics, physics, all of those things, sand moving around, nourishment's happening, and we play these games of let's run sea level up and see how long they last in that environment. And here's a case where just one simulation where we have two different levels of sea level rise, 3 millimeters per year and 10 millimeters per year on a barrier island. That's a North Carolina-like barrier island. And in the case of 3 millimeters per year, they last for a long time. In the case of 10 millimeters per year, they abandon really quickly. This is property value through time in years. Excuse me, this is dune height through time. beach width through time. So the up and down stuff is beach nourishment happening in the model. Dune building is happening in the model, abandonment. And so what we learn when we do this is, just to say it quickly, in all these simulations, the economic system mitigates until the very end, as they did here. Right until they abandoned, they were nourishing the beach, they were building up the dunes. As you can see here, big storms occur, things the property value, they build right back up. There's a whole host of reasons that this happens, but build back, and often build back bigger, is what occurs in these models as it does in real life. So they rebuild after storms. If you ask the question, what dictates how long they stick it out? Some of the important things are subsidies. Subsidies can cause them to stick around longer. Outside market increases. They think that the outside market's increasing and they see profit to be made at the coastline, they'll stick it out as long as possible. And if they're backward looking, if they're forming their view of risk by looking backwards in time, that makes them stick around longer. Okay. So I'm going to skip over the next one just to save time. So this is just part of our system. We stick around the whole time. Fragility increases. So how about a solution? What is necessary to dynamically influence the coastal system on long time scales when the future fate of system is forced by sea level? So I'm not saying this with any judgment. I can just say it as a scientist. The issue here is capitalism. If you look at the coastline as a source of profit and you want to maximize profit on short time scales, this is the trap you're going to get set at. And this is the trap everyone's. And that's just the system. And so I'm not going to suggest that we should remove capitalism. That would be pretty hard to do. So what kind of things could be done short of that? And I'll just show you this title from a recent news article. This occurred in Spain. This lagoon is effectively a person, new Spanish law says. So they decided, after some pollution had impacted the lagoon and killed a lot of sea life, to call in the courts, give that lagoon all of the protections that a person would have. So justice, human justice for the lagoon. So this is basically a formal way through the law to do what indigenous cultures have done for centuries, is to think of the landscape in the same way that you would a human being. So how does that work? This new law doesn't regard the lagoon and its watershed as fully human, clearly, but the ecosystem now has a legal right to exist, evolve naturally, and be restored. And like a person, it has legal guardians, including a scientific committee, which will give its defenders a new voice. The lagoon can sue people. And this isn't the only case that this has happened. This has happened in other places. It happened in New Zealand. I won't go through this, but it happened in New Zealand, similar idea. And so what I'll leave you with, you want to really do something here, Bald Head? This should be the headline in a couple of years. There's powerful lawyers that live on this island. There's people who know way more about this than I do, but I can tell you dynamically, if you can pull off something like this, you'll change the future of Bald Head Island. You have a perfect scientific committee that can sit there and decide what it means to be harmed, the barrier island, writ large, ecosystem, everything. So maybe that's where we should be headed. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That's definitely thought-provoking there for sure. Awesome. Yeah, it's great. All right, next up, Joel Kostka from Georgia Tech. Joel's a repeat. I think this should work. Yeah, this works if you want to use that. So thank you.
The advances there.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks to the Conservancy. Thanks to Dick and Pat for inviting us. It's lovely to be back. I'm going to talk a little bit, hopefully, on the more positive side. Well, and I'm firmly behind Dylan and all the others that are talking about difficult scenarios, but I also want to talk about the value of coastal ecosystems that surround us here on Bald Head Island, and in particular, talk about salt marsh. So last year when I was here, I talked about the resilience of these systems, the sea level rise and other stressors. This time I wanted to talk about the basic ecology and biology of these systems and a little bit about my own research. Okay, and so I mentioned this last year, you have a lot of salt marsh in Carolina, okay? And as Dylan was alluding to, these ecosystems are under threat from sea level rise and other stressors. So I want to start out with the questions for you. How do these systems benefit you? I know we have a lot of knowledge in this room. How do salt marshes benefit people? Who can give me some examples? Yeah. Water purification, that's one thing I'll talk about. What else?
Recreation.
Recreation, right? Yeah, all that great fish and shellfish that we love to eat. What else? Anybody else? Okay, well, let's go through whatever. Carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration, Molly's gonna talk about that later, definitely. Okay, so here's an example somebody mentioned. Marshes are important nursery for fish and shellfish. So that is the small fish and shellfish spend all part of their lifestyle in the marsh to get bigger, so they don't get eaten by predators when they're small. Okay, there's lots of nutrients, lots of food in the marsh. Physical barrier from storms. So salt marshes act to the vegetation in these coastal ecosystems acts to dissipate tidal surge energy and therefore protect those. And here's the natural cleaning mechanism that was mentioned as well. I call the salt marshes the kidneys of the coast, because they act to naturally clean water as the water flows from the land surface across the coastal zone and into the coastal ocean. And many of them, I work on microbes actually, and don't worry, I won't talk a lot about microbes. I'll give you some introductions, but it's those microbes that actually clean that water naturally. Okay, just wanted to mention carbon sequestration. This is going to be talked about later. But though the salt marsh comprises a very small area, if we think about it as a marine system, okay, about half of the carbon that's stored on the seafloor is stored in these marshes. So they store a lot of carbon and potentially removing that from the atmosphere. Okay, so I want to talk now about the basic ecology of a salt marsh. Okay, where does the food come from? When I talk about where does food come from, I mean, where's the base of the food chain? Okay, and I think probably most of you would say it's plants. The basis of a food chain is often plants, okay? With some caveats that I want to talk about. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this really well, but the base of the food chain in a salt marsh is plants, right? But it's not how you might think about it, right? There aren't a lot of animals or insects, for example, that eat plants directly. Okay, it's the detritus that is the base of the food chain. This is partially digested material. Okay, so here's the plant material, and just showing you that a lot of different plants that you see out there in the marsh around Bald Head Island serve as a source of this detritus, which then feeds the small animals. Okay, and that plant that's really important is a plant that's focused grass or Spartina alternivora. When you look out over the marsh, might be in your backyard, you'll see this plant. And most of the field of the marsh is actually clonal, meaning all of it is identical genetically. There's not a lot of sexual reproduction in the salt marsh. So that's a side point, okay? But this plant is arguably the most important plant in the coastal zone in the United States. It dominates the coastal ecosystem on the east coast of the United States and also in the Gulf Coast. So it's that map that Dylan showed. And it also plays an important role in coastal restoration. A lot of times when we restore these ecosystems, we plant grass, and so we replant this grass. Okay, and I don't know if you can see this well, but these are the primary consumers of that detritus that I was talking about. That partially digested plant material is eaten by these small critters, fiddler crabs, grass shrimp. These are really abundant in salt marshes. Largely, you can't see them. Well, you can see the fiddler crabs. You can't see grass shrimp because they're in the tidal creek a lot of times. But some worms, other crabs these are the guys that eat these detritus directly. And then those are eaten by some of the more charismatic organisms that you know about. The blue crab will eat the smaller crabs. Okay, and then you see the fish and the shorebirds are eating the smaller invertebrates and animals that I was just talking about that are the primary consumers of detritus and the osprey. So this is really what I wanted to get to. The detritus is actually plant material that's colonized by microbes. Okay, when you look at a salt marsh, you see brown stalks and you see green stalks. The brown stalks are last year's crop. Spartina is like corn food, right? It grows up annually and dies every year. Okay, so it's the microbes that are feeding on that plant material that make it more juicy, make it more palatable for animals to eat. Okay, so that's detritus. It's a detritus-based ecosystem. Okay, and we study the microbes that are the basis of that detritus. Okay, and so this shows a salt marsh food web. So here you see the plants in the center. You see fiddler crabs that feed directly on that detritus. You see mussels, worms, and shrimp that eat that detritus, then are eaten by the larger. Okay, now I want to shift a little bit and talk about what I do, the microbes that we study. Okay, and what we've been studying is this natural gradient that sets up in the salt marsh. I don't know, if you go next to a large tidal creek, the plants look bigger. If you go into the middle of the marsh, they look smaller and stuff. And so we study that stress gradient that happens naturally in salt marshes. You know, so these grasses seem a little bit more stressed and don't grow as tall. Okay, and we use this natural change in the plant form to better understand how plants and microbes live together, how the microbes help the plants grow better. Okay. And so we have been studying the microbiome of these plants. So just like in your bodies, you have microbes that help you grow better. Plants also have microbes inside of their cells that help them grow better. And so we have and we call this the microbiome. So that's just microbes that are intimately associated with a plant host or a human host. And we have discovered microbes that live inside the roots of this plant that help it grow better. Okay, and I'll mention two ways. One way is that they help the plant take up nutrients through a process we call nitrogen fixation. Only microbes can do that process. Okay? So it's essentially like a little cell factory inside the plant root that helps it take up nutrients. Secondly, these microbes help the plant to detoxify its surrounding environment. These salt marshes are sulfur rich, and some forms of that sulfur are plant toxins, actually. And so these little cell factories inside the roots help to remove those sulfur forms that are toxic. And so what we call these endosymbionts. Symbiont means living together. Endo means inside the plant. And so we've published on that. So again, we use metagenomics or genetics techniques to study that. We could talk about that later if you're interested, but I don't have time to get into it today. I did want to get into some more practical examples of how we might use this microbiology. Okay, and I call this probiotics for plants. So I said that this plant is really important for salt marsh restoration activities. And so just like we take probiotics to help us grow better or be healthy, we can hopefully add these microbes when we plant plants for restoration to help them grow better and establish better in the ecosystem. So that's one project that we have funded by Georgia Sea Grant to look at that. How can we better understand the microbes that live in association with these plants and then manipulate them so we can increase restoration success? And here's an example. So we've been studying the microbes that actually live on the leaves of these salt marsh plants. Okay, and here you can see a little orange color on the leaves. This is something we discovered last summer. There are actually microbes, microbes are a natural part of the leaf flora, as I mentioned. That's part of that phyto-based ecosystem that I talked about. But we're thinking that some of these microbes that are on the plants, when the plant is stressed, might turn around and attack it. Might be opportunistic pathogens. And so this is one of them that we think it's an orange rust. It's a fungus that lives on the plant that we discovered last summer. And again, we're studying this with genetic techniques to identify it, see it in a pathogen or disease causing. And then another thing we're working on too is that one problem we have in the Southeast coast is that if we want to do restoration, there aren't a lot of farms or nurseries that are producing these. So we need to provide a certificate of plants that we can use to plant for restoration and mitigation processes. So we're working with people to grow these plants in the greenhouse and optimize their growth so we can produce more plants for restoration. And so one of the things we've done in the last couple of years is to try to take microbes out of a healthy marsh add them to the plant that we grow from seed, and get them to grow better and faster for restoration. And what we've seen is we can just take an inoculum out of the soil, so microbes that we get from a healthy marsh, add them to the roots of these plants that we grow them from seed, and they grow better. So we've been able to make some progress on that. Ideally, we would have what we call a biofertilizer, a microbe that we add to the plant as we plant it, so it will grow better. That's used in agriculture. Okay, so I wanted to end with talking about something that I talked about last year, and that is what are some different management strategies that we can use to restore the marsh. Molly's going to talk about this in a lot more detail than I just wanted to sort of revisit this project that we have actually in the urban marsh in Charleston, South Carolina, to restore an area where the marsh has died back. And so these are some of the techniques that Molly's going to talk about: living shorelines, which means for me grass planting and oyster reef restoration. We can increase marsh elevation, which is key to the health of the marsh. I think you're going to talk about that too. Okay, so I won't talk about that, but that's another strategy. And then also I wanted to show you some examples of tidal creek restoration. So the tidal creeks are the life's blood of a salt marsh. The tidal waters bring in oxygen, bring in nutrients for the marsh. Okay, so this is a project that we have funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We've been working on this for 3 years, and we'll have 4 years to actually restore the marsh now. So we mapped it, we showed that grass planting worked, and now we're doing the restoration. And so I don't know if you can see this. I showed this last year. We do this, so this is the area where the marsh died back, and we've been planting plants for the last several years, and it's working well. Okay. So this shows you the oyster reef restoration part. So this is caged oyster shell that we put down to stabilize the shoreline and also serve as a substrate for new oysters rooting in. And then this is the grass that we planted in the last couple of years. You can see it's doing really well. In some cases, it's doing as well as the natural marsh. And then this is what I want to show you. This is from last week, doing the tidal creek excavation, which is, we think, also important to the long-term sustainability of the systems. Digging out tidal creeks that were silted in over the last decades. Okay, so here you see them setting up the lines. We do this all with volunteers, all with natural materials. And so this is where they laid out the lines. This is where they dug out one of the tidal creeks. You can see it's real glamorous. And so there's more of the work there. And I just want to end thanking my students that actually do the work.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Okay. So. All right, our next speaker is Molly Mitchell from Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Molly was here last year as well, so thanks for coming back. And I love the salt marsh. I know everybody knows that, how much I love them.
And you're going to hear a lot about marshes today, so this is great. Okay, so I'm going to talk specifically about blue carbon and how this changes under sea level rise. And I want to start by saying, okay, so what is blue carbon? First of all, it is not blue. Okay, that's a misnomer a little bit. We call it blue carbon because it's associated with marine systems. So blue carbon is any form of organic matter that is stored in marshes, seagrass beds, or underwater sediments. Okay. And so this is opposed to green carbon, which is plants and trees and that kind of thing. So we're interested in blue carbon because it's a permanent removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So when you hear about news articles, CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere, when it's stored as blue carbon, that is a permanent removal of it, which means that it is both taking it out of the atmosphere and storing it. And it also means that if these systems go away, that carbon is released to the atmosphere. Okay, so it's like banking it. Why are we particularly interested in it now? We've known forever that salt marshes store carbon. We're interested in it because of the idea of blue carbon markets, which have become a big thing. Not an economically big thing yet, but a big concept, okay? And the idea is, okay, when you buy a plane ticket, right, you get the ability to buy a carbon offset now from most places. Usually those are trees, so people are going out and planting trees to offset the carbon emissions from a plane trip. And the idea is that we could use our marshes instead in that way, so we can turn our marshes into economic resources. Oh, and that's just a little note from NOAA that a square mile of salt marsh stores the carbon equivalent of 76,000 gallons of gas in a year. Okay, so why are marshes so effective? Why do we store our blue carbon so effective? So when our plants, they sunlight, rain, carbon dioxide, right? So that's their food. And they convert that into stems and leaves and also to roots. Okay. So in an upland system, we have a lot of oxygen that's in the soil. So what happens is the roots, as they die, they oxidize, and so they're not stored. So most of our carbon in our upland system is stored in the stem of the tree, okay, or the leaves of the tree. That's, you know, that come and go. But in the marsh system, the sediment doesn't, it's waterlogged. It doesn't have a lot of oxygen. And so when roots are formed, they can die, but they never degrade. They just store it in there. And in this picture, so the carbon goes down to like about here. Okay, so it's this really long length of carbon. There's all these little roots in there. And so this provides the marsh with some of its stability. It provides it with its ability to absorb water, floodwaters. And it also stores that carbon. Okay, so what is the problem with sea level rise? And we've been storing carbon in marshes forever. What happens? And this is important because when we talk about the next time I'm going to talk to you guys, it's going to be about living shorelines. This is going to be important for that too. Okay. So if we have a marsh, what happens when sea level comes up? Okay, so we have erosion at the front edge of the marsh, and that can bring sediment up onto the top of the marsh. And the marsh can actually grow upwards. Okay? The marsh can also move landward. So we have two pathways. We have migration, which is the marsh moving landward. And we have accretion, where the marsh actually builds itself upwards in the tidal frame. And this helps us get blue carbon. And I'm going to show you, anytime you see a little asterisk, that's a process that builds carbon. Anytime you see two asterisks, that's a process that causes us to lose carbon. So erosion causes that carbon to be lost and it enters the atmosphere. Okay, so migration doesn't change really carbon content at all. The marsh just continues to build carbon. That's controlled by sea level rise. That's a fairly straightforward process and easy to predict. It can be modified by human decisions. So when we build a bulkhead behind the marsh cannot go landward anymore and it ends up drowning, and all that carbon is returned to the atmosphere. The building the marsh platform upwards is a much more complicated process. So it's controlled by how productive your plant is, how much sediment there is available coming into the marsh, and how much respiration is occurring. So how waterlogged that soil is. So we have a much more complicated process here. It's harder to predict, it's harder to control. Okay, so as sea level rises, we start to see our marshes migrate into our upland areas. And these are what we call ghost forests. So this is a forest. These are the dead trees where the marsh has migrated into that area. When we see that, we are going from a green carbon stock, so carbon that's stored in the stems of the trees, to a blue carbon stock, so carbon that's stored in the sediment, which is actually a longer lived stock, except that sea level is kind of threatening that. If we look across a gradient, so if you imagine where we have this system, this is out on the eastern shore of Virginia. And so this is marsh, this is old marsh, and these red areas are areas that were forest and are now completely marsh, but they're young marsh, okay? So we have old marsh and young marsh, and then we have marsh just newly forming on the edge of the forest. And so if we look across that gradient, what we see is in the old marsh, we have really deep carbon stores. And then in that kind of medium marsh, we have medium depth. And then in the very newest marsh, we have really shallow depth carbon stores, right? Because we just haven't had time to build the carbon up. So the younger the marsh is, the less carbon it has stored in it. Okay, so the important thing is our eroding edge is the edge with really, really deep carbon, a lot of stop. And our migrating edge doesn't. Okay, so what's happening? This is actually, I showed you guys this last year for anyone who was here. This is sea level rise curve from the gauge up at Wilmington, North Carolina. And these are the wiggles that we were talking about. Okay, so the orange line is the predicted trend, but we know that in years it goes up and down around that trend line. But we're looking about 1.5 feet of sea level rise out in 2050. Okay, so we have sea level rising fast and it's accelerating. Okay, so it's rising faster and faster and faster each year, a little bit faster. So that means when we're talking about a landscape process, so we've got marshes moving across the surface of the earth, but now they're moving faster and faster and faster and faster, which gives them less and less time to build up that carbon as they move across the landscape. So what does this end up looking like? This is Kostka in Virginia. And it is a nice big marsh here. You can see these blue areas are our low marsh, so that's our spartina alterniflora. And these areas that are the pink and yellow are our high marsh, and so those are spartina patens. So this is a old marsh that has more than 100 years of carbon sequestration in it. It's got very deep blue carbon stocks right now. And this is the time scale, so this is 2020. So as we move forward into what we see happening is we see the waters, the tidal water is starting to come in, and so that marsh is starting to migrate with it. And this is 2060, 2080, 2100. Now, at this point, all the dark blue is underwater. Okay, that marsh is completely gone. And this light blue is the new marsh. And then there'll be some high marsh up in these areas. There's also a community. I've got to point out there's a community that lives right there. Okay, so what do we have now? So we have this marsh here in 2100. This marsh has been here for about 40 years now, so it's sequestered some carbon. This part of the marsh is brand new in 2100, so it has only a little bit of carbon sequestration. It's also, if you look at it, the total area of the marsh is much, much smaller than it was, right? So we've lost both the depth of carbon and we've lost the extent of the carbon, so our stocks have gotten much, much smaller looking forward. So what are the important things? What can we do about this? So the most important thing is whether we can maintain or slow the loss of this marsh, right? So the storage of the carbon in this marsh is actually globally important. We don't want it put back into the atmosphere. So we need a reason to store the carbon, and that's a little bit where the blue carbon markets come in. It gives you an economic reason to preserve that marsh. The marsh also breaks wave energy, it provides habitat, it improves water quality, all the things we were just talking about. So it does other things too, right? So we really want to see if we can maintain as much of this marsh as possible moving into the future. The other thing we want to do is we want to preserve this land here so that the marshes can migrate. Because if the marshes can't migrate here, we'll lose all of this. There will be no carbon in the future in this area. However, there is a community that's living here. So allowing a marsh to migrate in there is also making a decision that we're going to move that community out of the area. So these are the difficult kind of decisions that, we're looking at in the next 30 or 40 years having to make. Okay, so the uncertain part of our future. We don't actually know how much blue carbon we currently have stored in marshes. This is a graph from New Jersey going down to South Carolina. These are marsh stocks in different carbon stocks in different marshes. The important thing is they're all over the place, okay? Like there's some very short bars there, there's some very tall bars there. It's highly variable, it's hard to predict. We do know that the wetlands extents are changing, and so the blue carbon is also going to change. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with sea level rise. So these are for Wilmington, these are the 6 scenarios that NOAA came up with for sea level rise, and you can see in 2100, they're projecting anything between 2 feet and 11 feet of sea level rise. It's a really big difference, okay? That looks really different across the landscape. So we don't really know where we'll be in 2060, and this is a challenge for predicting our future resources. But the question that we're left with is really if we can use market forces, can we use a blue carbon market to help protect these marshes, and then we get all the additional benefits that come along with the marshes, in addition to the carbon storage. And I'm just gonna say the blue carbon market has been slow to take off for a number of reasons, but it is starting to build. Okay, and so that's all I had to tell you. I don't know if we have time for questions now, but I will be around this evening. Also, I'm always happy if people want to email me. My email address is very easy, but feel free to email me with questions.
So we have time at the very end of today's session to ask questions. So write them down, keep them in your brain. I'm sure we'll find some time. All right. Next up, we have George Bonner from the Coastal Studies Institute. Thank you, George. George is an engineer. So we'll fix some things today.
Yeah.
All right.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Got to explore the island a little bit yesterday afternoon, and it really reminded me of where I grew up on Roanoke Island up on the northern Outer Banks, the oaks, the sand dunes, the salt marshes. And I grew up in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, and saw that island and the Outer Banks go through exponential growth. And we had large tracts of land that were undeveloped, that got developed, and seeing those competing demands between, you know, I grew up commercial fishing, working in the construction industry, and those competing demands between growth, fishing, protecting natural resources. It got me interested in engineering. So, and I was also interested in working on the water. So I went to Coast Guard, and I was a civil engineer and got to work in the civil engineering program. And a lot of our infrastructure in the Coast Guard is kind of at that front line. You know, I spent a lot of my time on islands, lived in Kodiak, Puerto Rico, working on islands all over the U.S. and the Caribbean. And just dealing with that changing climate, we were front line, and we were, you know, every storm came, we got hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild, and you know, we were part of our facilities. But what I realized is, you know, we're not an island. We got to look at the whole community approach, because we depend on the community for schools, utilities, and so, you know, kind of having that whole community approach to dealing with this changing climate is really important. And my last couple of years in the Coast Guard, I got to work on a pilot program sponsored by the White House up in the Hampton Roads area, Virginia, and kind of bringing all the stakeholders together. And I think that's the key to dealing with these challenges. So when I retired from the Coast Guard, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I knew I wanted to move back to North Carolina. I was never stationed in North Carolina while I was in the Coast Guard. But I got opportunity to come back home and work with this North Carolina Renewable Ocean Energy Program, and how we're going to harness those same dynamic forces of the ocean that I was worried about, protecting the mariner and protecting our infrastructure from. How can we harness that and make a positive difference and support our clean energy needs? Here we go. So what is marine energy, ocean energy, marine hydrokinetic energy? It all means the same thing. It's the power of our ocean waves, our ocean currents, our river currents, our tidal forces. How can we use that energy in a productive and a responsible way to support our clean energy needs? And this graph here is done by the National Renewable Energy Lab. It just shows the potential energy available with our marine energy in the U.S. And what it's showing is we can power over 60% of our power needs with our marine energy. So we're not going to have wave energy converters or tidal turbines all around the U.S. But even if we use 10% of that, it can really support our overall clean energy goals in the U.S. So North Carolina came out with a really good clean energy plan in 2019. So it's focused on producing affordable, resilient power for North Carolina. And two important goals are, one is 70%, reduce our greenhouse gases by 70% by 2030, and then carbon neutral by 2050. And North Carolina is a leader in solar energy. We have hydropower, we have nuclear power, we got offshore wind we're going to talk a little bit about, but we're not going to get there with that alone. So how can green energy play an important role in reaching those goals? So North Carolina legislature came up with this program was established in 2010, kind of forward. People in Europe were just starting to look at it then, and it kind of set us up to become a leader in the U.S. in advancing marine energy. When it was set up, it was focused on the colleges of engineering at NC State, North Carolina A&T, UNC Charlotte, and led at the Coastal Studies Institute in one of the Outer Banks in Dania. That's the building I worked at up there on the right. I think what we've realized since then, it's more than an engineering problem, it's multidisciplinary. There's a social science piece, there's a policy piece, there's the environmental side of it. So bringing all that together, I get to work with researchers across the UNC system in advancing these solutions. So right now, the cost to produce power using marine energy, the levelized cost of energy is much higher than how we can produce energy with solar or other means. So we're focused on right now on what we call power in the blue economy, powering other needs in this marine environment where it may make sense, it may be cost effective to provide power for those needs. Some example are powering ocean observation equipment. The National Science Foundation is moving the Pioneer Array, which is a set of instruments from it's up off New England now. They're moving that down to the mid-Atlantic next year. So how can we power some of those instruments with marine energy so they don't require batteries and maintenance to power those things? Aquaculture is a growing industry. How can we support some of the power needs for aquaculture? Underwater vehicles. The Navy is moving towards unmanned underwater vehicles. So we're doing some really cool research in powering those devices using marine energy. Water desalination. Obviously, the need for drinking water is growing with saltwater intrusion and other demands on our aquifers. So how can we use marine energy to power desalination? So some of the examples, the bottom picture, that's a kite system that we developed at NC State that's being funded by DARPA, by DOD to power these unmanned underwater vehicles. The middle picture on the right is a UNC Charlotte team that's commercialized a technology to use wave energy for water desalination. And then up on the right, North Carolina's got the second largest ferry system. They're going to move towards electrification in the future. How can we support potentially using marine energy to help support the power needs for the ferry system? So last year we were selected by the Department of Energy as a National Marine Energy Center. It's called the Atlantic Marine Energy Center. We're part of a consortium with the University of New Hampshire, Lehigh University, and Stony Brook, which provides us some great funding to support our research and advance our testing. We have a testing platform that's NetSpear and NAGSHID, where we put devices in the water. We work with researchers and industry developers. As part of this Atlantic Marine Energy Center, we're putting in a microgrid so we can help power the energy needs on the pier with marine energy. So we're really excited to be part of that consortium. So some of the work we're doing is engaging with stakeholders to understand different needs, competing demands in the marine space. So how can we, to deploy devices, what are some of the challenges, working with other stakeholders. This is some of the work we do. It's just a graphic representation of how all those things come together. I mentioned wave power desalination. We were selected by the Department of Energy to host this Waves to Water Prize. So what teams together test different technologies on using wave energy to desalinate water. We hosted that event last year. There was 4 teams that competed in the event. There was $3 million in prize money. So that was really exciting. This is just some of the technology, some of the teams. This is us deploying one of the devices over the pier. This is on the upper left, that's NetSpear, where we test the devices in the blue hatched area where we were testing for this competition. Another cool program I'm involved in is a DOE program called the Energy Transition Initiative Partnership Project, and it's focused on energy resilience for island communities. And growing up on an island and working on islands, we're always the first one to lose power and the last ones to get it back on. So I was excited to be part of this. We're working with folks in Hawaii and Alaska and up in Maine. It's been fun. But we're currently working on 2 projects, one in NAGSHID and one on Koke, to help build energy resilience for those islands. There's an open application now. This program provides technical support through the national labs, not only in building resilience, but also moving towards renewable energy. So encourage island communities to apply for this program, and I can share information about that program. So we have an open application right now. It's just some of our testing that we do. This is the kite system that I was talking about. We're tow testing. This was a couple of months ago to simulate the current. This is a scaled version, the actual version that DOD is going to use, a larger version. Do an Ocean funding for that next year. Offshore wind, so who knows about offshore wind in North Carolina?
It's not a great.
So this is the Kitty Hawk lease, up on the upper right. So, Avenue Grid Renewables is developing that, they probably had outreach events down here this last couple of weeks, and went up to Nags Head. Our program is not focused on offshore wind, but, we see it as an opportunity to, maybe look at hybrid solutions where, because they're going to bring the grid there. So how could we, in a responsible way, potentially use marine energy to complement offshore wind and produce, more energy, more clean energy. So doing that over in Europe now. We just had hosted some folks from the Netherlands that came out, and they're looking at these hybrid systems with floating solar, marine energy, offshore wind, and so there's a unique opportunity there. So we're working with Bowl, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and North Carolina Task Force on an offshore research area that we could potentially look at those type of solutions in the future and research that. This is students from North Carolina A&T. They compete in the North Carolina Marine Energy Collegiate Competition. The last 3 years, they got a team that's going to DC here in a couple of weeks. But this is them testing one of their devices in our wave tank at the Coastal Institute, and they won an award that year for that device. And then this is Lindsay Dubbs, our associate director, and she just recently got recognized by the Clean Energy Education Empowerment Initiative. And this is one of our students in North Carolina A&T. So really great. We do a lot of outreach with students, middle school, high school. We have interns from NC State and other colleges at Coastal Institute this summer. And so, just building those future innovators and stewards is really important. Oh, this is another event we do. We do host the North Carolina Renewable Energy Challenge. So it's not only focused on kids building wind devices, but we also have a marine energy challenge. And then we hosted that last weekend at our campus. And then the winners from that go to compete at national level. I'll be around all day and look forward to answering any questions.
Our next presenter will be Chris McCall. I think everybody here knows Chris. He's pretty important to this place. Yes. Yeah. Talk about our shoreline management. Thanks, Chris, for coming back. And I know you're busy, so we appreciate it.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be back again for a second year for the symposium. Thanks to Dick and Pat, of course, who I personally have known for going on 20 years now, having spent the last 20 years here working as a town manager. Well, 12 of those I was the assistant manager, and then in 2016 stepped up to the plate, and council offered me the position at the time to be the village manager. So been here ever since. So I've seen firsthand sort of the changes of our shoreline, having walked it in numerous periods of time, almost on a daily basis, particularly with the construction of the terminal rolling back in 2015, 2016 as one of our big projects that we undertook. But the focus for today I want to talk about is the project that we've been discussing with council for 2025, which is our next locally funded shoreline protection project. So with that, I want to just briefly mention about coastal storm damage reduction and what that is. I think some years ago, you'll attest to that, there was sort of this misperception about when people would call it a beach nourishment project, that was sort of like just taking money out of your pockets and throwing it out there on the beach and the sand washing it away. And so they came up with this title of coastal storm damage reduction, which really is about the protection of everything behind that dune system from the threat of coastal erosion that can then undermine, the public and private infrastructure behind it, to include the roads, the water, sewer, and possibly private infrastructure, the club, the golf course. And so over the years, the village has made that a focus and a priority to manage that. And I think we've done a really good job in doing that. And when I say we, that's including you all, many of you in this room as property owners on this island, because you have acknowledged the importance of that to the extent that you help to fund these projects to maintain that shoreline. Without you all, it would not be possible. We know of some other areas, shorelines or beaches that haven't really bought into that together. And we see what the result of that has been when they've been hit with storms, with storm surge and flooding that has negatively affected their towns. So what I'm about to show you is not to alarm you, but I think there may be some folks here that may not have been here in the early 2000s that did not know what things used to look like. And for that, I want to show you so you get a sense of what we had dealt with back then and how far we've come so far. So this goes back to the late 80s, where you see the remnants of the old inns out on South Beach. Notice all the shoreline there, right? This is a photo of American Shore and Beach magazine back in January of '98. You can see the ongoing erosion on the ocean front, but in particular, this was at a time when the village got the variance to install the sand tube groin field that exists today. It still serves a purpose. This goes back to Hurricane Floyd. We all know that hurricanes are very unique in how they impact shorelines. Back when Floyd hit, we had no real primary frontal dune system to mitigate from the storm surge. So that storm pushed and flooded everything behind it, right? This is back in '02 with a number of the homes that are out there on South Beach, south of South Bald Head Line. But you can see, you know, a number of those homes had sandbags protecting them. They were out on the ocean front. And this was just, I think it just happened to be a winter storm that came in, and not a king tide, but just a storm that pushed through. This is the entrance to Bald Head Island Club, here and here. You can imagine Hurricane Charlie, that storm surge pushing through. They had some lagoons there in the villas in the front of the club that had some fish in them after this storm. Where I mentioned about coastal storm dam reduction, protection of the public infrastructure. Here we've got the roadway. This is South Bald Head Line. You see remnants of water, sewer line. This is sort of South Bald Head Line as it runs around. How many here, by raise of hands, is this new to? I'm sorry, new to, but you've not ever seen this. Okay, so that was good. How many of you have seen, witnessed this personally? Right. So you folks talk to those folks. All right. Again, South Bald Head Line. This is a sandbag revetment that was put in to protect South Bald Head Line in front of the club. Eventually in the end of 04, 05, the Corps, by way of the Corps Navigation Dredging Project, did the sand placement, pushed up over the revetment, and we subsequently planted it with sea oats and Durapanthum, and so you see what exists today. But back then, you could ride in your golf cart. If you ride in your golf cart down South Bald Head Line, you could literally look out to the ocean and see it. course, you can't see it today because that dune feature is probably 17, 18 feet tall over the years. When we talk about the village's shoreline stabilization program, it's really simplified to a three-legged stool. That is that we need sand from the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Beach Disposal. We need our locally beach renourishment projects and then structures all together working. If you take one away, the stool falls and it doesn't work. So it's a very simplified strategy. When we look at the sand that we get from the core channel dredging project, we know that we get that on average every 2 years, which is the blue. So here we got it in 21, 23. To supplement that, the village does the projects in between here in 2018. This is one we're planning for in 2025. It is off by a year here because at the time the Corps did not have enough funding from Congress to do the project at that specific point in time. This is just a photo of South Beach back in 2019 after we finished our private project, just to show you sort of what it looks like today and how far we've come. Back in the day that the erosion or escarpment would get to this line here. So we've built up dune through projects in width and then height. And that's evident too with all the beach walks that we're trying to get folks to extend out and over out in the front, the ocean front vegetation line. Also, we've added that width of dry sand beach as well. This is just a recent drone photo of the core project with the sand placement that's happened through this winter. When we talk about structures, we know we've got the soft tube groin field. In addition to the terminal groin structure, which all working together slows the erosion of all that sand coming back towards the channel. I know there's been a lot of this is emphasized on what we've done to protect and good South Beach towards the channel. But we know that we've had this erosional phenomenon occurring down at the east end of South Beach in and around the Shoals Club. And so when we're working on our privately funded project, we have much more control over where that sand goes and how much. Unlike with the core project, you know, the Corps' their priority is just getting the sand out of the channel. It is not where they're putting it on the island per se. And they only get a certain X amount of funds to do it. Once they reach that point, they put the switch off and they're done. But with our private project, we have total control. And so we've been working with our coastal engineer, Eric Olson, on the conceptual design for the 2025 project, which we've been working on with regards to permitting, engineering, design, and permitting as we speak today to be able to get the permits in hand to do this in 2025. So this is something that just doesn't happen overnight. A lot of the time it seems work that has to happen to make it happen. But also including the financial effort to secure the funding to be able to pay back the cost on the project, which is something that I'll work with council on and setting all that up. But just so you know, towards the east end of South Beach here, this was pre-stage 2 development. I want to say Southeast Beach Drive runs along right along that maritime forest line there. So obviously this was before the club was built. There was a lot of area out there back then. Of course, over time, this was in November of 2022. January of 2023, the club did some work to put in a sandbag revetment to try to mitigate that. And so folks say, ask this phenomenon that's occurring down there at the east and the south beach. And in working with Eric, our engineer, this phenomenon, what's occurring is if you look at this map, which shows the sand transporter, where the sand's going along South Beach. You have a nodal point here where the sand sort of makes its way back towards the channel and out through around the terminal groin and up West Beach. From the nodal point, you have some of that sand transport that actually goes back towards Frying Pan Shoal. And then you've got sand transport that comes down from Carolina Curry Beach on down. But over years, this Frying Pan Shoal feature has been bifurcated. And a lot of that sand's just sort of jetting through there. Also, this shoal feature kind of wags back and forth. Right now, it's sort of wagged out this way to the east or north. And that's why you see a lot of that accretion and dune growth along the East Beach properties. Coincidentally, a lot of the homes that were built some years ago had a design to them where they had the first floor with the kitchen and the living areas for entertainment. And because you could see the beach at the time. Now a lot of those homes are designed where the kitchen and the entertainment areas are on the second floor, where they get that view to the water. But sort of a trade-off, what would you rather have? I'd rather have a nice, tall, wide frontal dunes to take the impact of a tropical storm or a hurricane to protect what I have behind it. So that phenomenon that's occurring, in theory, as designed by the engineer, with Jaybird Shoals as our borrow site for sand, which we used in 2010 and 2018. We're going to go back to Jaybird Shoals and dredge from there and place the proposed fill locations to fill our terminal groin and to fill through the soft tube groin field. And then start back here and put in a nice robust fill on down to the end of South Beach. And so, I'm sorry, this here is about midway, a little over halfway beyond the island, on down to the very end where the Shoals Club is. That section of fill. But we know we got to put some sand in here to sort of maintain that fill with the terminal groin and through the groin fill, because some of those groin tubes will have to be replaced. They're made out of a geosynthetic material that breaks down over time. And on average, 5, 6, 7 years, you have to replace them. So that's sort of the proposed beach fill locations at present with the use of Jaybird Shoals as the borrowed site. I know Joe will get up here soon and talk about Frying Pan Shoals. I'll just say that the village has worked to try to secure the permits to use Frying Pan Shoals as the borrowed site, but we sort of ran into some hurdles with the regulatory agencies, in particular the National Marine Fisheries, with concerns over negative impacts to the benefit products of fish. Little fishies that swim out there. I'm just a village manager. I'm not a technical guy. So, but that's pretty much the conclusion of my presentation. I'll be here for a little bit. Unfortunately, it's my son's birthday today. So I told Chris I won't be able to make it to the dinner tonight. So I'm going to take him out for his birthday dinner. But if you don't know where my office is, it's the first door in Village Hall on the left. I don't know how many town managers or city managers' first door is the first door to the entrance of the building on the left. That's where mine's at.
All right. That's a perfect segue into our next speaker, Joe Long from UNC Wilmington, who's going to talk about Frying Pan Shoals dynamics. Really nice. Together.
Well, I appreciate being back here again. I was gonna say that this is the second year I think I had to follow Chris, which is like coming in the room after a local celebrity, which really isn't fair. So if I'm back the third year, you need to change the schedule. Last year when I was here, I talked a lot about some decision-making tools that we've developed over the years based on some scientific research on shorelines and geomorphic change. This year, I'm going to switch and talk to you about a new project that we're just starting. And so this is sort of an overview of the project. You'll see 0 results or very little data collected. And so maybe that's my way of trying to hook you so that I do get invited back for a third year, but time will tell if we get there or not. And so I do just want to acknowledge, so this is a project that's being funded by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a separate entity within BOEM that does not do sort of the wind energy group. This is the marine minerals group, and they regulate minerals and sand resources in federal waters, which is more than 3 miles off of the coast. And so, coming back to sort of that 3-legged stool example, beach nourishment and renourishment is sort of one element of many community-wide coastal resilience strategies, right? It's not the end all, the only solution, but it's one element of that. And so this is an example from Kitty Hawk, similar to what you see here in the beach renourishment projects. But access to those sand resources is diminishing. And so we hear that sort of, at Jaybird Shoals and some other locations. And so more and more often communities are looking to new resources for sand, or looking for those to be permitted, or looking for those to be resourced. And so if we think about, even if we sort of narrow down, that's sort of the big broad, the global sand resource. But if we narrow down into Southeast North Carolina alone, the Army Corps of Engineers in 2020 did their South Atlantic coastal study, their SACS report. And they sort of looked at what does the sand resource need over the next 50 years in all of these different communities in Southeast North Carolina. And what they found is that anywhere where you see green, they actually had a surplus of available sand, meaning more sand than they needed for the next 50 years. Anywhere where you see in the red, they don't have enough sand there. They would not have enough sand for their resource need. And so in New Hanover and Brunswick County alone, they only have access to about 70 to 78% of the sand that is needed. And that's based on available resources that have been tested and permitted, some coring to figure out what sediments are in those locations. So based on the locations that we know about and the amount of sand that needs to be placed within these different communities to sort of maintain what they've been doing, there's simply not enough sand. There's an imbalance. And so Frying Pan Shoals is often looked to as a big pile of sand. And so communities look to that as one of these potential resources. In fact, Oak Island, sort of, your neighbor over across the river, they have as part of their beach management plan, they've been looking at Frying Pan Shoals, and their local engineer has been doing some vibe reporting and some geophysical surveys of Frying Pan Shoals. And they estimate that in state waters, there's 29 million cubic yards of sand. And so that's within the 3-mile boundary to the coastline, this black line you see on this map. And within federal waters, so outside of that 3-mile region, there's 58 million cubic yards of sand within Frying Pan Shoals. And within particularly even just these areas that have already been tested. However, Frying Pan Shoals has been designated by National Marine Fisheries Service as essential fish habitat and a habitat area of particular concern. There are times when the habitat of particular area of concern is sort of one localized regions where things have sort of been identified or tested. My understanding is that pretty much all of Frying Pan Shoals, or everything encompassed within Frying Pan Shoals, has this existing designation. And so to date, there have been concerns about the potential impacts of dredging of Frying Pan Shoals to the habitats that live on Frying Pan Shoals. And so far, my understanding is that the communities that are looking towards Frying Pan Shoals as a resource have been looking at the resource in state waters. That is outside of BOEM's jurisdiction. However, I think they see the writing on the wall, which is essentially that there will start to be potentially some applications for permitting for sand that are in federal waters. And so they want to try to sort of understand these concerns. And so they've done a number of things over the past couple of years. They've conducted a wide range of stakeholder interviews. back starting in about 2020. We sort of went through and assessed what's our existing knowledge and data that exists for frying pan shoals. They convened a technical expert workshop and some stakeholder workshops later in 2020 and 2021. They conducted fisher interviews because we also have that frying pan shoals as a commercial fishing area. So there's a lot of activity on the shoals. And so throughout this 2-year process, they tried to identify some sort of major knowledge gaps and what are some potential resource priorities in order to understand this system a bit better. And really it came down to that a better understanding of the dynamics, so just the physical dynamics of the shoals and the habitats on the shoals, a better understanding of that in general is needed before they can even evaluate whether or not there will be impacts based on dredging and whether or not what things they should do to mitigate those impacts. So before we understand the impacts, before we develop mitigation plans, we first have to understand and collect data about the shoal itself. So that is where sort of in about 5 months ago, UNCW came into the picture to try to work with BOEM as part of a collaborative agreement in order to maybe close some of these knowledge gaps, collect some baseline data, and follow through on some of these research priorities. So I have sort of some bigger, broader bullets here if we think about just the overall study goals. And then I'll get into a bit more of the specifics here in just a second. But we want to understand sort of the habitat and the spatial distribution of key species on frying pan shoals. Understand the benthic communities. So that's, and Chris mentioned this, there's a concern that dredging, which you're pulling up the benthic environment and the things that live in that environment, what is the impact to those benthic communities? Is it long lasting? Is it the same no matter if you are dredging sand during different times of the year? There's sort of all sorts of questions you can dive into with that. We also want to understand just the sediment transport to the shoals. We talk about it being a big pile of sand, but it's dynamic, it moves around. Where did all that sand come from? How fast does it fill in? If you were to dredge an area, are there areas that infill faster than others? And then the other thing is that there have been sort of similar shoal environments, and we call these cape-attached shoals. And there's been some studies, I'll show you one, on some other cape-attached shoal environments, but not one that has this big dominant Cape Fear River just adjacent to it. So there's a lot of questions about interactions between the Cape Fear River and frying pan shoals. The river plume itself, sort of nursery areas and key species, and the exchange between the riverine environment and out to frying pan shoals. And so they're looking to us not to come out of this and to say, you should dredge this area, you should do this. It's just to close the gaps on some of that, providing some baseline actionable data that they can use to make the decisions in the future, and also start to develop some modeling tools that they can use to examine potential impacts of dredging on frying shoals. So those are kind of our broader goals. As part of that, and I'll show you the sort of team from UNCW here in just a second, but we started to drill down into maybe some specific objectives, meaning we want to use a combination, or throughout this 4-year time period of this study, we'll use a combination of measurements and modeling to, first, we need to characterize the sedimentary environment of frying pan shoals. There have certainly been some geophysical surveys and some vibrocores that have been taking at frying pan shoals, but they've been in very isolated areas, right? Mainly funded by communities looking at particular areas that might be used as a sand resource. We want to sort of fill in that space and do a broader geophysical survey of sort of, I won't say the entire shoal environment, that would take us 4 years to just do that survey alone, but track lines that extend much further away from where the current information is. So we want to know, is this a big pile of sand? Is there a hard bottom area underneath the top layer of the shoal, for instance? We also want to characterize the oceanographic conditions. And so we know that this thing moves around a lot. Well, it moves around a lot because of the waves and the currents and the other physical oceanographic characteristics. And so we want to understand sort of and measure those different characteristics at different times of the year. And then I mentioned we want to understand the sediment transport to the shoals. We want to understand sort of the formation of this shoal feature and understand the pathways. Chris already showed you, he showed you that map, he showed you those red arrows, and this is how we think the sand is being transported to the area. And I'm not saying that that is not true, but we want to know how big those arrows should be, right? We want to do more studies to figure out, is more of it coming from you know, the East Beach into Frying Pan Shoals is more of it coming from whatever is placed on South Beach. And so we want to be able to do a bit more detailed sort of investigation to figure out the size of those areas. How does that change with time? How does that change with seasons? Sort of northeast swells, you know, versus southeast wind waves, those kinds of things. We want to establish some baseline data in terms of the habitat. So baseline data for the benthic community. So we're talking about seasonal variability across a couple of years. We also want to look throughout the food web. So not only just looking at the benthic communities, even though that's oftentimes what's brought up as potentially what needs mitigated in terms of dredging, we want to look then throughout the water column. Look at the plankton, look at zooplankton, sort of look at things that are they infected to the shoals? Do they live on the shoals? Is that their primary location? Does that change with seasons? And then go all the way up to sort of these key fish species that rely on those. So we've put together sort of, this is a UNCW and BOEM collaborative agreement. It's really comprised of myself as a coastal engineer. We have a number of physical oceanographers on the team, biological oceanographers, fisheries biologists, coastal geologists. And then really the people that will make all of this happen are the operations staff at the UNCW Center for Marine Science, using the vessels at CMS in order to do a lot of this work. I put these names up here. I'm really fortunate to sort of be this team of folks who have specialties in a lot of areas where I do not have specialties. And I put them up here because many of you are local and maybe you know some of these folks from UNCW. I started to put their pictures, and then I realized that some people have really outdated photos of themselves on their faculty web pages, like from when they got hired many, many years ago. So I decided it wasn't very representative. So we're going to collect a lot of data, right? I could sit down and just tell you, we're going to collect a lot of data and we'll tell you in a couple of years what's going to happen. But we want to design what this field sampling plan should even look like. And to do that, we're taking a look at some work that's been done in these other Cape-attached shoal environments, particularly at Lookout Shoals, and then some work that's been done actually down in Cape Canaveral in Florida. So we're going to look at data that's been collected in these areas. Sort of they've come up with some hypotheses about the way that that shoal operates. We'll design our field sampling plan to see if Frying Pan Shoals operates in a similar way. And then sort of contrast that and see if any of these are maybe particularly because of the influence of the Cape Fear River. So I'm just going to give you one example, and this is sort of how we're kind of designing this. This is an example from the late 90s in Cape Lookout. And so you see the landform here, you see Shackleford Banks, net transport from the north. This is the submerged shoal environment. It's hard to see, but there are black arrows that run down the spine of this shoal, and then some black arrows that feed into the side. And so throughout this study, they estimated that there was 400 to 500,000 cubic meters per year of sediment that was coming down from this direction, and about an order of magnitude less that was coming over from Shackleford Banks in order to sort of feed this shoal environment. They found that it was a sedimentary feature, a big pile of sand, but that it still changed through time. So that there really wasn't a hard bottom structure here. It was all sand, but that it was quite variable with seasonal fluctuations. And then they found that it's both sort of the wave environment that likely brings that sediment to the shoals, but then it's really the tidal currents in and out that takes that and moves that out the spine of the shoals. And so when I say we need to go out and measure the physical oceanographic characteristics, it's because we have to understand that balance between waves and tides and which part of the shoals are activated by which of these processes. So we are in the phase of our study, which is the field sampling plan. And so we've been refurbishing instruments, purchasing instruments, and sort of developing where we will collect information. This is sort of a mock-up of the kinds of things. I really just show you this to show we're going to put a bunch of instrumentation out and around the shoals to measure waves, currents. We're going to look at fluorescence. We're going to look at temperature and salinity and sort of all of those things and how they change. We're sampling for 2 years every season, so we'll be out during 8 different sampling periods to measure all of these things. And then we'll be developing some numerical models. This is an example of a wave model, sort of a regional scale wave model, because that helps us fill in, right? These are the dots where we're collecting data. But this area is so complex that individual dots don't tell you the whole picture. We'll be using wave models and current models and sediment transport models to fill in those gaps and develop a better process understanding. So address these existing knowledge gaps, provide some actionable information, and then continue coordination because there are a lot of people interested in frying pan shoals or that use frying pan shoals now as a resource. I know you're standing there. I just need one more minute to tell you that there's because of this is focused sort of offshore frying pan shoals, you know, but that sand gets there from this environment likely. And so we can't just use all of our boat-based information. And so while that's the part that BOEM is funding, we've been, you know, looking at some other things like these are shorelines, these are derived from satellite images. So while we typically get shorelines once a year or so, maybe from sort of consulting services, satellite images give us a lot more information through time. A couple of things, you know, red here is more recent, blue here is much older, back to the 1980s versus red is up to 2020. And a couple of things you can point out, if you look over here, see all these red lines that suddenly are really close together? Well, that's because there's a terminal brine there and that area doesn't change as much now through time. Then you look over here at the Shoals Club and you sort of see that phenomena that you have been witnessing, but you also notice blue is older. Well, it did build out, now it's gone back. And so these are the type of data you can use to look at the timescales of that motion through time. Take the photographs that Chris has been showing you and try to quantitatively sort of measure that. Last one, I also just want to thank the Conservancy because of this meeting last year and me sort of getting to know Chris and Beth. We were sort of able to come with a group of 4 of our coastal engineering students last week. We put out wave and current measurements or sensors in the surf zone to measure those processes right in the surf zone. These colored dots here, you see our elevations. We took GPS surveys of the shoal itself and the beaches on either side. And that data, again, while not funded by BOEM, we were able to sort of come and collect that data and make use of their resources, and we appreciate that greatly. I will stop.
Thanks, Joe. You know, the plug made all the difference on whether we gave you the hook or not, so I appreciate it. All right. Yeah, so many fascinating things to learn. And don't worry, the village only needs all the information by next year. So it's true. See, so Molly Mitchell's back. Tracy Scrable is going to go and talk about living shorelines, which is something we want to do at the Conservancy this year. But Molly has expertise in lots of things, including living shorelines. So she offered to kind of give an overview of that. I think it's a great topic. So thanks, Molly, for stepping in again.
Yes, so I love to talk about living shoreline. So I'm sorry that Tracy couldn't be here, but I appreciate the opportunity. So this is just to start off, this is one of the living shorelines. You can see little researchers running around that we've been studying up in Virginia. But one of the things about them is they're really beautiful. One of the reasons I enjoy working in. So what is a living shoreline? This is actually a really loosely used term that applies to all kinds of things. So it can be, and originally they were just planted marshes. This is where people went in and planted marsh, an area where there wasn't there before. And then over time, they started putting sills in front, originally rock, and now we do a lot of oyster sills that go out in front of them. But then living shoreline can also refer to beach breakwater systems. The really critical thing about a living shoreline is that it is mimicking the natural processes, not disconnecting them. So, you know, our marshes, we want to have access in and out of them for the fish and animals. We want them to give the same functions as a natural shoreline. With the beach breakwater systems, what we want is that sand to still move along the shoreline. So you don't want to stop the sand and pin it. You want it to keep filling and refilling, okay, so that you continue the connection with the rest of the shoreline. Now, having said that, the way you engineer them does actually make a difference in what kind of functions it provides. So this is actually, this is a beautiful living shoreline with this really long continuous sill in front of it. That's problematic, okay, it keeps the marsh from eroding away. But it also prevents animals from being able to access the marsh. They need like windows or something where they can get in at the high tide. If your sill is above high tide, they won't be able to access the marsh. Then it's not really fully a marsh. Okay, so we have kind of from like the very top, most natural, that's the thing that's gonna function most like a marsh, and as we move down the spectrum, you lose some of the functions, but it's still better than hardening the shoreline in terms of function. One thing I would like to say is occasionally we see things like this pop up. This is not a living shoreline, this is a planter, okay? So it is it's got a bulkhead in front, it's got riprap behind, it's actually got another bulkhead underneath this riprap. And so there's some grass planted in it, but that's never gonna function the way living shoreline does. Okay, so trade-offs. So we have our traditional hardening, timber, concrete bulkheads, seawalls, concrete seawalls, that kind of thing. Rock, okay, so this was back in the 70s and 80s, almost everything was seawalls. And then in the 90s, rock revetments became much more popular. You started to see them emerge. And then in the early 2000s, living shorelines started to become a thing. And they're still growing in popularity. And so now it's kind of like, these are the most popular, and then these are growing, and these are declining. There are some trade-offs, okay? And it really is depending on the function you're gonna have. So in terms of dissipating wave energy, so reducing incoming waves and reducing erosion associated with them, and during a storm surge, also reducing wave damage from the storm surge. Anything with vegetation is really good at that, okay? So all of our living shorelines are really good at that. Our rock revetments are actually okay with it. Anything that is a hard vertical surface just reflects wave energy, it increases erosion on the sides of it, increases erosion at the bottom of it. So this is not what you want when you have a high energy wave system. In terms of preventing flooding, now preventing flooding is something people, of course, are becoming more interested in as sea level rises. I am going to say that none of these solutions stop flooding. Okay, they stop wave energy, but they don't stop water from coming up. If you want to protect an area and keep it, you need a seawall. That's the way you keep water out. Okay. Reducing erosion. So yes, they can all reduce shoreline erosion, although like I said, the bulkheads tend to increase erosion on the sides of them and at the base. Supporting native species, really our living shorelines are amazing in the supporting native species part, and the traditional hardening doesn't really support them as much. Rock revetments are kind of in between depending on the species. Out on the west coast where they have a lot of seawalls though, they have started, and in Australia, they've started putting little niches in seawalls for urchins and stuff to live in. So they've been trying to make these a more friendly habitat. And then our last thing is potentially self-sustaining under sea level rise. So I just talked to you about the way that marshes can retreat landward and they can build their sediment up. So anything with a marsh in it actually has the potential to change, to like continue to protect the upland as sea level rises. These solutions are engineered for a particular water height, and as water comes up, it will overtop them and they will not be as effective anymore. Okay, so sea level rise and marshes. So the question is, can living shorelines survive? So a marsh, okay, has to migrate, it has to rise up, right? So a living shoreline is a marsh, that's what we're creating. And so the question is, will they survive? Well, they'll survive as well as a marsh would in that area. But we're also engineering these systems, so there are some things we can do to help make them survive better than a natural marsh, actually. And I just want to give a plug, if you're interested in science, this is Applied Ecologist blog, okay, and this is run by a journal, the Applied Ecology Journal, but they have all their scientists write like short, friendly to read blogs. So it's a fun place to go and learn about new science that's going on. Okay, so the answer is when we have room like this, you can see, okay, this is a nice flat lawn. You see there's all this lawn and the house is like way back here. There's plenty of room for this marsh to migrate with sea level rise. So this is a living shoreline that's going to persist in the long term. Now, this one, it's a little hard to see, but this is the marsh here, and then there's a really steep bank there. Okay, that marsh doesn't really have anywhere to migrate to. This is a short-term living shoreline. It's going to provide services in the short term, but eventually it is going to go into water. We also see that if we have living shorelines in urban areas with roads behind them, or if people put bulkheads behind them like that planter that we saw early on. But there are things, like I said, we can do. So here, these marshes can't migrate, but we could encourage them to build themselves up. And so then they persist a little longer. So how do we do that? Living shoreline. Okay, so to encourage migration, what we want to do is we want to look at, okay, we have our marsh, and we have our low marsh, and we have our high marsh. So we know the low marsh is like the most at risk. Okay, so you can focus on making the high marsh really wide. So the low marsh can be narrow, the high marsh can be wide, and over time, the low marsh becomes the high marsh. I mean, the high marsh becomes the low marsh, yes. And you have a nice wide marsh. The other thing we can do is we can say, where is our marsh going to be? So we're going to look at the area where our marsh is going to migrate into upland. And we're going to focus on planting things there that are good transition species. So not trees that are going to die when the plants come in, but there are some bushes and shrubs which are very salt tolerant and can live and persist there and then kind of gracefully give way to the marsh grass. So there are things we can do to kind of help the transition part there. And there's actually a lot of research going on right now on what to plant in those areas. That's a hot topic. Okay, the other thing, so we want to like build it up. So what are the ways that a marsh captures more sediment? It captures sediment when it has really tall, really dense grass. So the taller and the denser the grass is, the more sediment it captures. And if we look at this graph is showing the dark blue is natural marsh grass density, and the light blue is living shoreline grass density. And we find almost across the board that living shorelines have lower grass density than natural marshes. Why? Probably because of the way we plant them. We plant them on like grids, like 1 foot centers, okay? And that's just not the way grass grows naturally. We were talking earlier about it being a clonal plant. And so it tends to grow out from like big clumps naturally, instead of on 1 foot centers, which is how we plant it. So one of the things we want to do is find a better way to plant the grass, actually. And there's been some research suggesting that if you plant clumps of grass instead of 1 foot centers, the grass will spread faster and will grow better and be denser. So that's one of the things we can do to help our living shorelines persist. The other thing we can do is looking towards these sills. So these are oyster sills, these are oyster bags. And these are sills built out of those oyster bags. And it's a little hard to see, but you can see there's fish and things living in it. It becomes a little mini reef. They're cool little habitats. So these oyster bags are not just dead shell. They actually recruit oysters to come and live on them. So what happens is over time, the oysters grow up on top of the bags. And so as sea level rises, the oysters actually grow up too. And so the sill grows vertically with sea level rise. And so it helps protect the land behind it, but it also helps reduce wave energy so it can trap more sediment. One of the other things that can do that is there are ribbed mussels in here. These live in salt marshes. And ribbed mussels can also create big clumps that help trap sediment and bring them in. So we can add these dynamic components in there, and that helps the longevity of our marshes. And then if all that fails, we can go to our thin layer deposition, which was mentioned earlier. And this is a technique where you actually take sediment, dredge spoils usually, and you spray it in a really thin layer on the marsh. And so you physically add that extra layer to it. This has been used in some really very successfully. It's been used in some big marshes up in New Jersey, Delaware, that kind of place. But there's actually a lot of interest in it in Norfolk, where we have a lot of tiny tidal creeks that get dredged all the time. And so you have to figure out what to do with that dredged material. And so we have a lot of marshes that are drowning there. And so the question is, well, could we just take it from the creek and put it on the marsh? And so this is another area where there's a lot of research going on into how we can do it. But this costs some money, but it is a way to make things increase. In addition, it tends to improve the grass density. So then the marshes just naturally accrete more sediment. So, okay. So in conclusion, living shorelines really are beautiful sites. They provide a ton of habitats and they keep that natural setting. And so just like here on this island, you have this beautiful natural setting, right? So you can protect the shoreline and you can provide stability, but you also have all the benefits, the natural benefits that would come from Marsh. And then I just wanted to do a shameless plug, but we actually did write a book a few years ago on living shorelines, but all the major people who designed living shorelines around the coast contributed to this. So it's a how-to book. It's of how you would engineer. And that's it.
Beth, it's going to be complicated. We got a living shoreline. Good thing we have experts to help us. Yeah, that's right. Okay.
While you're getting mine set up.
Yep.
If you have a phone that can connect to the internet and you want to participate in some research, go ahead and pull it out. And if you need the Wi-Fi password for here, because your LTE ain't working, let me know and I will. It's if you have bald head Wi-Fi, all lowercase. The network is BHA Wi-Fi, yes.
Some interactive stuff.
Yeah.
So Samantha Mosier from East Carolina, we're going to get into, probably happens more often than not, just the social discussions of defining sustainability and what it all means. It's not easy, as we're going to find out. So thank you, Samantha.
All right. So while I'm doing that, I'll give you a little background. So I am a trained political scientist, but I teach public policy. That's my specialty. I teach in an MPA program. So I teach folks how to go out and be city and county managers, handle budgets, do fundraising, fun stuff that government does. Now, a large part of my research actually has to do with local sustainability and now resiliency, as I'll talk about in a minute. And on my other side, I study sustainable agricultural marketing. So I do a lot with semantics and linguistics and the language that surrounds some of these discussions. I'm just going to use this button related to how we make collective action decisions. So like, how do we come to certain policy decisions where we aren't all arguing with each other? Because we do that a lot. So what we're getting ready to do before I give you the whole spiel about what is sustainability and resiliency, which is that a component, is I got to give you some consent to collect data. So I got 2 questions that we're going to do live, and then there's a series of questions from the back end. All of these questions, the data that's being collected is for a grant that I'm on. I'm one of, I think now 23 folks sitting on this grant. I'm a part of the social science team. It's part of, it's led by researchers here at East Carolina University. It is funded through the National Science Foundation's Coastline People Grant. Anything that you give, I will use, but there will not be identifiable information. What ends up happening within the system is there's like a little IP address or a respondent ID. And so I'm just going to pull your information, but I won't know who's who in this audience when I leave here and collect it. I do have paper copies if you want this, and that was required by the IRB for me to get it through. And I am more than welcome to give those to you now or later. So how do you respond to questions? Well, you can pull up your browser and type in pollev.com, ECU Water Center 349. That is the center I'm affiliated with. Or pull the camera up on your phone, hit that QR code in here, and it'll pull up a little yellow button, go click, and it'll get you right in. Is it working?
Yep.
I use my students in one of my classes in Kenny to see how the software runs. They really like to correct.
Yeah, most of us went to school when that was common, so.
All right, is everybody in?
Yeah.
Bald head Wi-Fi, all lowercase. Yeah, I got very confused.
Okay.
And just to let you know, for some of us that do a lot of social science research, seeing the data collected live is really exciting. We like seeing it. Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there. I know this is eating into my 15 minutes. I'm totally fine with it. Anybody need help? I'm saying I'm an expert, but
That's where
bald head Wi-Fi, all lowercase. I should have put it up here, but I didn't think to do this. Phones in there. Take a few minutes to connect and get in. Here, fingers crossed on this next one, because I think I've pulled it up and it's ready to go. All right, are we ready? All right, so first one. All right, 50 words or less, and I know that's a lot, but we have academics in the room, we like to talk. 50 words or less define the concept of sustainability. And this is going to live action everything that comes in to show you the common words that are pulled out of it. So what this is showing you is that the bigger that the word is up here, this is the most common language that is used among us in this room that are actually replying. So balance, environment, way, system, natural. The way this ends up working, and when we're looking at the language that is used around particular concepts, is that it's going to pull common words out and it's going to blow it up and magnify it when you're looking at a word cloud. Oh, this is beautiful. Some of the smaller words that do end up showing up that typically when you start cleaning language to do like natural process or natural language processing and you're analyzing text as data, is it will pull out smaller words that are not common. And in here, it's not actually showing it. Like be a effort and efforts would get condensed. You would use the STEM word, which is effort. And it would clean all this up. And it would just keep changing. Everybody good here? People still entering? Oh, it just changed. All right, so what I'm seeing, just looking at this, is that your key words as a group are going to be future, resources, system, environment, and way. And then over here, long, that's actually going to matter quite a bit because that's a temporal concept that typically comes into discussions when we're relating it to sustainability. All right, now I got another word for you. And I saw one of the first people that actually defined this, put resilient in there. So now the question is, what is resiliency?
How do you get to that?
It should automatically populate. If not, you might have to refresh the browser. And I will look on my end. Let me see. Let me exit. Oh, it should be activated now. Word ability and try to get the same meaning out of it and condense that down. All right. What do we think of this one? We got a lot of words up here, don't we? It's not quite as plain as sustainability, is it? So the big one is ability. That comes out of when we talk about resiliency, and the ability to withstand is probably what I'm guessing some folks have wrote it down, ability to withstand that kind of business. Some of the other smaller words will kind of show up here. Will be respond, situations, natural, function, back. I'm not even sure what that would mean without context. So we all good on this one? All right, so I'm giving you this exercise and because I've made other people go through it. It's because we don't actually have a common definition is the problem for any of these terms. So to give some background, sustainability is kind of an old concept policy-wise. It goes back to the 70s. We talked about it more in the 80s. And then in 1987, the UN Brundtland Commission came up with what is seen as one of the major, most common definitions we use for sustainability. It's actually a sustainable development concept. It is not sustainability. But they said, well, we're meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we got needs of somebody. We don't know what that means. It's pretty ambiguous. We got an intergenerational dynamic. So we have a temporal concern about people at a future date that we may never meet. So great-great-grandchildren, if you choose to have kids, your great-great-grandchildren will be there. And some folks actually consider them while others do not. Now, this is very much so heavy on the development is one of the major criticisms of the UN perspective that came out in the 80s, which is not surprising if you lived through the 80s. I did not, I'm an 80s child. But in the 80s, it was really big into money, 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 deregulate the economy. And so the emphasis was on economics and development. So not surprising that this definition came out of that era. But since then, we've kind of transformed our concept of sustainability and what is usually seen as the three pillars: economic, environment, and this thing called equity. Now, most individuals will say, I understand the economic component because we have concerns about development, capitalism, which was mentioned very early. We are very much so in a capitalist paradigm. It's hard to break that. Environment, some of us love the environment. We want to make sure it's preserved. Some people think there are intrinsic values. So when we talk about giving legal status to ponds and forests, that's because we see value in and of itself that maybe we should protect it in such a way as if it was like a human. Equity is a little less understood, and that's mostly because we choose to ignore it because the idea of equity is uncomfortable. Because typically we start getting in discussions about distributional wealth considerations. How do we tax people? How do we share the resources that we collectively pull together? And then what happens? I'm not saying it's happened here when you're dealing with instances of managed retreat at the same time that those areas are gentrifying. And so these are all very complicated discussions, very contentious discussions to have with individuals, especially when we don't have a common definition. So equity is often ignored in discussions of sustainability, often because it's uncomfortable. And I'll come back in a minute and explain more. Oh, then resiliency. So I wanted to bring this up because this is a new catchphrase on the scene, and it's replacing the concept of sustainability in a lot of respects. I first heard the term resiliency spoken at the EPA about 10 to 12 years ago, and it was kind of hushed. And the reason that it was hushed is because sustainability, you think 10 or 12 years ago, we're coming off the Obama administration, and all of a sudden, gasp. Conservatives and the Republican Party did not like the idea of sustainability. It was seen as very democratic, very anti-Republican, and this happens with language quite a bit. It is the same reason that global warming then shifted into climate change. Still the same processes, it's just different language use because it's all politicized. So resiliency is new. Governor Cooper here did Executive Order 80. There's been quite a bit of money trying to be dumped into resilience planning within the east of the state. And what this generally means, and there is no agreed upon definition, is the ability to bounce back from shocks. What does that mean? We don't know. Talking to some individuals at a recent resiliency planning conference that was held in Greenville, they were specifically talking about, well, resiliency is seen in one breath as an emergency management dynamic. Like we have to respond as soon as a hurricane comes in so we can be resilient to be able to come back later after. There's also a holistic view of resiliency in that we have to be culturally resilient and understand that things are going to change. And so it's much, much different than an emergency management. And now you're starting to see individuals within this realm starting to fight with each other because there's funding attached with it. And if we go back to sustainability, funding is a key component to our existence. We like to have money to do things. Now, the kicker is that if we go back to sustainability, I was able to somehow, I don't know, get some consumer survey data. And this company specializes specifically in sustainable marketing. And they had a data set where they said in a few keywords, what is sustainability? So there were 4,100 responses. It was beautiful to look at. What we ended up doing is we stemmed the words out. We pulled things that didn't matter. We took the language that was there and we did some topic modeling. And all that means is that we sorted people into different categories based on the language that they used. There are 8 different definitions, according to this data set, running around out there about what sustainability is, which is oftentimes why we hear it's greenwash, specifically in marketing. Now, the largest category is this general environmental support and protection. So they use language like, we need to support the environment, what is harmful to the environment, we need to end, good, survive, level, and rate. So they were talking about a general conception. The other scary part is some people in this category actually just use the word sustain to describe it. Yikes, right? Woo, scary. Especially from like, we hope that we can get people beyond using the root words to discussions. Now, other major categories included the idea of reusing and replenishing. So this kind of falls in, and I know how much of you know about environmental discourses and paradigms, but this one is very much so in line with our current perceptions about use and reuse. So the idea of recycling, and we still use natural resources as a capitalistic measurement. That's what we want. Then we have the consumer base, those are very similar but different language. And I want to mention this one down here because I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting ones, is there were some definitions that were solely intergeneration based. Did not see anything but saying future generations are the main concern. We need to take them into account with the language use. So general population, very much so all over the board. So I got curious because I'm on a 5-year grant and they gave me money and support. And I'm like, this is awesome for social science. We don't really get a lot of money to do stuff. And so I even tested it out on our own people. So I said, there's about 23 of us that work on this grant now. I noticed in the past year and a half that we're talking past each other. So it's really, really difficult to solve problems if you don't have this common language. So about a month ago, this is very recent, I sent out the same questions I just got you to ask. I sent them out to our research team and I did it during spring break. So it was amazing that we got 15 people to even respond back. And this is what came up as common language. Now, I didn't do any natural language processing. I didn't use the AI. I used Word to go through it. Befittingly, we shared somewhat of a similar definition, which made me feel better. We see the 3 pillars, environment, economy, and equity show up. Oddly enough, and I think this might be a bias because, we're academics, economy didn't show up as much as equity. Environment showed up in 6 out of the 15, kind of gave me a pause. But we did have these 2 dynamics of the temporal consideration and the extraction and the trade-off, which means we still capitalize natural resources in such a way that we think that there's a market value to them. And that's what sustainability is about, balancing all these other considerations. Now, I don't know who did it because I got the anonymized data, but somebody actually used the word resilience in their own definition. I don't know who it was. I wish I did. I'd have questions for them personally. But even when you have highly trained individuals that I guess we spend a lot of time talking about this, we still can't seem to agree. And then because I got super curious, because our grant is specifically focused on resiliency and looking at systems and cooperation, I gave them this. And this looks very similar to what we just did as well, in which there's a lot of words being used. Some more, some not so much. So ability showed up here. That was also really common in our group. But only 2 people decided to use capacity. And those are 2 different types of terms. And I'm almost at time. So here's what I'm going to end with, because I knew this was going to happen. Is that when we're talking about sustainability, a couple things to keep in mind specifically at the local level. Only 1/3 of governments were surveyed in 2016 is actually having sustainability plans. Some of that incorporated resiliency. What's even more concerning, some other work that I did, we found out that performance measurement, so seeing how we're doing to get to those points, we also don't do a great job with measurement. Only about 1/3 of the communities that we surveyed separately actually measured performance. Resilience is as unexplored. And then the last thing I'll end with, before I pull the questions up so you can answer them, is that looking forward, some of the biggest questions is that if you're looking at timeframes and you're trying to get everybody to agree, we have to look at timescales. So not just, the geography and things like that, so the spatial components, is that your county here has an emergency plan in place for disasters. They have a continuity of operations plan. That's very short term. There are recovery plans being developed. But what we are not seeing occurring when we start talking about these uncomfortable discussions with long-term considerations is that resiliency, a little bit more long-term, you got to figure out how to come back after a shock. And then sustainability are those really long end games that you're aiming for. It could be 20 years, it could be 30 years. But how do you have a common discussion around those when we can't even agree on the definition? And so with that, if you have the ability and the time and the desire to help research, I'm going to activate it now. There are a series of questions. They won't pull up on here. The link should remain live. Basic demographic questions about you. And the reason that I'm asking about those, because they may seem personal, is because these are statistically significant, meaning they explain why certain definitions are the way they are. So the intergenerational, I can tell you that it's typically Asian Americans or those of Asian descent that use that intergenerational language. It's not people who are white. It is not people who are Black or Hispanic. It's Asian Americans. Why? I don't know yet because it was a survey, but I hope to find out one day.
Well done. Thank you very much. I had asked Jim Brown, who's a Conservancy board member and board member of the Smith Island Land Trust, to give a little, island perspective on on sustainability, resiliency, and the future of the island and land preservation especially. And so he was traveling, but he went ahead and made a short video for us that I'm going to show now. So I'm going to press play and hopefully we'll be able to hear. Okay, it's it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Brown, and I'm speaking to you today as representative from the board of directors of both the Bald Head Island Conservancy and the Smith Island Land Trust. I had very much hoped to be with you there all today, but I was unable to attend in person, so Chris asked me to make the recording instead. And here we are. Like many of you, my family has been coming to Bald Head for many years, and as both residents and longtime visitors, we have seen Bald Head go through a lot of change. At the moment, I believe that the island is not only in a period of change, but one of rapid transformation. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. Bald Head is a barrier island, and barrier islands are, by their very nature, both resilient and adaptive. They change. Without those qualities, we wouldn't have the beautiful coastlines, the diversity of the marsh, or the acres of maritime forests that make Bald Head not just memorable, but truly exceptional. In fact, the North Carolina Heritage Program has designated Bald Head as a site of national significance, recognizing that its natural communities are among the highest quality of their kind in the nation. And I think that's why we're all here today. As the island goes through this natural process of change and development, we're wondering how we can ensure that it's doing so in a way that preserves not only the historic and tourist aspects of the island, but also in a way that protects those natural populations. As the island transforms, how can we show that our presence is a net positive in the island, rather than degrading or interrupting those important natural processes that have helped form the Bald Head of today, that barrier island that we all love. And the good news is that the island is indeed both resilient and adaptive, and so is its community. When the 19 families of the island's Generator Society arrived on Bald Head in the 1970s, there was no marina, there were no restaurants, there wasn't even electricity. But what they did have was a vision for the future of Bald Head that included people living in harmony with nature, despite all the development and change it would take to get there. And even today, as we're already seeing the impacts of an increased human population and the results of all the development of homes and the infrastructure needed to support that population, it's absolutely critical to acknowledge that we're only halfway toward achieving that original developmental goal established by the Mitchell family. This means that for every developed lot on the island, there's still one more that is undeveloped and still for sale, awaiting a future resident, restaurant, or store, and the expansion of services that is going to be needed to support that growth. Think about what Bald Head would be like with twice as many homes and twice as many people on its beaches. It's daunting to consider the scope of all that change and what it could mean, and quite frankly, it can be a little terrifying or even overwhelming. So my goal, my personal goal in working with the Conservancy and the SILT is to break all that down into manageable pieces, to understand where I can have an impact as an individual and how I can impart meaningful change. When you look out your window and admire the view, consider what it is you're looking at. I looked out my window and I fell in love with this absolutely amazing oak tree. My family even named it the Ant. It has these gorgeous sprawling branches that are always covered in squirrels and lichen and resurrection ferns, birds. As I started to look more broadly, I could see that this oak supported and was supported by all the surrounding wildlife and the understory of a lot that was already for sale. This amazing oak's lot was slated for development. as per that stated master plan, this lot was part of that 50% of the island that is still hopefully one day going to become someone's home. Now, every one of us wants to preserve the island in a way that we remember it, regardless of when we first arrived. And while that is largely an achievable goal, it's not one that will happen without individual action or without your personal involvement. I fell in love with this lot in its natural state. It was a corridor for deer to cross to the forest. It was a barrier for storms and wind that protected my house. So I became very seriously and very personally involved in preserving this lot. The families of the Generator Society had a very broad vision for the future, one that I wholeheartedly support. And the Mitchell family built on that vision in an attempt to combine nature with sustainable island development. But when they originally discussed this concept, they couldn't possibly see the details of every individual developed lot or accurately predict the impact that that development would have more than now 50 years into the future. Now, eventually, I did purchase this lot and I did donate it. And my motives were both altruistic and very selfish. And that's okay, because it's the one small thing that I knew that I could do to impart meaningful change. And I told this story about this one thing that I did, this one manageable piece, because it was the beginning of a much larger journey for me. Considering the future of this one lot led me to thinking about all the other lots that surrounded it, which led me to just consider how they played into the island's ecosystem as a whole and what my role was in supporting that. Full disclosure, I preserved almost a dozen lots now, all because of this one tree, and I hope to continue doing more. This connection that I feel with the island and my passion for biology and ecology have helped me to find an amazing community of people in Bald Head who all in their own unique ways care about Bald Head just as much as I do. And the best thing about that community is that it's adaptive and resilient. It's constantly changing and growing. When we volunteer at Turtle Central, we meet so many visitors who are falling in love with the island for the very first time. These are the people who could one day become island residents. My family acts as nest monitors during turtle nesting season. And as much as we absolutely adore these little turtles, and as much as we absolutely hate being eaten by bugs every night, the real work of a nest monitor is making a connection with every person who comes along and wants to know more and to learn how they too can personally get involved. And we also help out at conservancy events like turtle trots or the fishing school. And we do that so that we can support the amazing staff of the conservancy who give their heart and soul to this island, even though they're not always residents themselves. But they are the ones who carry that message back to the mainland. Now, these are just small examples. There's any other number of ways that you could get involved too. There are any number of small steps that you could take to make meaningful impact on Bald Head, most of which will cost you nothing but some of your time and a smile. So it doesn't matter if we are scientists or residents or visitors. If we want to maintain the Generator Society's original vision for living in harmony with nature on Bald Head, then that job now falls on us. Our actions today will impact the island of tomorrow and influence how those future generations adapt to the challenges and changes of their time. So I invite you to look out the window and consider what you see. What part of that vision is important or significant to you? And what can you do to preserve it for yourself, for the island, and for the future that we will all share? Thank you.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah, when I watched it in my office, I'm like, I started tearing up a little bit, you know, saying, because that was really remarkable. So, but he brought together so many things. I think it really is important, right? I mean, who knows how you fall in love with a place, right? Everybody has different ways, but once you do, then share that love, right? That's a big deal. And having conversation with people. I mean, you came here today to learn and think and learn things you never even knew existed, right? That's a big deal. Now let's share that information, right? Who knows what conversation you might have with somebody else? It's like, hey, I care about that too. That makes sense to me, right? And the common language thing, I don't know how many people are in this room, 65, probably 65 different languages, right? But somewhere out there, there's words that matter back and forth. Man, that makes all the difference. Just a few words here and there. So thanks to Jim for doing that. I thought that was great. So what I want to do now for about 15 minutes is bring the speakers up, and we're going to set up a panel and allow you to ask some questions of them. So you're going to just kind of turn your chairs around and face the audience and see if you have some questions from the crew. Okay, do we have some questions? That'd be good.
Area basically all covered with sand. What's the impact on that? And is there going to be change or whatever?
I guess you that's what Chris would call it. You want to talk about that, Chris?
Sure. Is it okay if I sit, y'all? So the terminal groin, assuming you're referring to the terminal groin, I'd say after its installation back in 2015-16, the objective was to monitor it for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years with our coastal engineer to get a perspective on its performance and to be able to evaluate it based on how it was engineered and designed to then say one way or the other, is it working? And I think where we sit today here in 2023, that it's the conclusion that it is working. And it's just evident visually if you go out there and you see how much area has been established long-term with the growth of dune and grasses, and that has also flourished and creating a habitat area for endangered birds like the piping plovers and so yeah, it's but we do have to continue to maintain. We do have to continue to maintain it with episodic periods of sand replenishment. Yeah, it's working.
I wonder if you want to talk all the challenges of translating the studies into specific actions that can be taken at the local level. You've touched on it. Are there any communities that come to mind where the government and other groups have been aggressively pursuing the sustainability agenda, where we can point to specific ordinances, specific funding strategies, specific actions like land donation, for example, that are encouraged in a comprehensive way by the community, as opposed to one-off transactions.
I don't know. Go ahead, y'all.
Yeah, I mentioned that I worked on the Hampton Roads sea level rise pilot project about 15 years ago. And at the time, like a lot of the municipalities in the Hampton Roads area were kind of, this isn't happening. They were worried about losing business, tourism. And Virginia Beach is a good example. So they really put together a comprehensive plan, sea level rise adaptation plan. And it's a short-term, long-term plan. And it's a really good example, I think, of being all in and engaging with everybody on a holistic approach.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, though, that they have a great plan.
Yeah.
Okay, when it comes to implementing it, $1 today is still worth more than $1.30 years from now, and that's, I think, a constant struggle, yeah.
Yeah, and then probably didn't take that further and say on longer sort of timescales. I would say the answer to your question is probably no. The really hard issues that have to be dealt with some of these special communities, I haven't seen the community really taking on, like the retreat word and ideas for how you kind of unwind your positions for some of these special places that are in trouble. I haven't seen a community in the States that's taking that on.
I would answer the question a little different rather than a place, I would answer in time, and I think now is a good time to do this kind of work. There's a lot of money coming down from federal citizens to do the shorelines, to do this kind of thing. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation really is putting $170 million into ecosystem restoration. So that available to do projects like you're talking about.
And the state also has a RCCP program, that Resilient Coastal Communities program. And so they've been funding at the county level, each county projects on identifying vulnerable areas, actionable solutions, and then it's individual projects, it's individual lab projects, but they're asking at the community level and doing right through this RCCP program. They match them with an engineering firm that would actually eventually build the structure and give that money to which really benefits.
So part of the challenge in dealing with comprehensive like action to deal with some of these problems is the nature of the shoreline, right? Because it usually ties into climate change and but why people here can see that I come to you looking at human some interactions, right? And so there's been attempts specifically from the European perspective with developing policies and plans that are integrated. And that means instead of siloing some of these projects that would just be a one-off implementation to address the problem, it's going through looking at your administrative structures that are in place. So you can think about all the federal agencies and departments, but there's a need to have discussions about how land use is occurring in agriculture versus land use for residential development, what's happening with relationships at the same time, and that's just not happening. And then one of the things I didn't mention, local governments are strategic. Especially while you're smaller communities which are having population decline, can't afford to deal with some of these problems. This island is probably a lot different. Kind of talking about the budgetary situation, but there are communities that are nearby where they're going to be struggling to afford to provide basic services. And what does that mean in terms of demand for people coming here if somebody's wanting to build a house as opposed to over there with this utility?
There was a lot of discussion about the marshes and a healthy marsh. Do you have any about the health of our marsh system? And also we talked a lot about little plants or the little growth in the food chain, but we also sometimes have water and turtles and dolphin and maybe a shark now and then. But how do you judge the health of something like this, which is 10,000 acres, more or less, and what's the current situation here?
Well, I mean, maybe I'll let Beth address that for the water. I mean, that's a great question. What is health? Right? What is a healthy system? Nature does this, and then it does this, and then it does this, right? I mean, how do you define nature? I mean, you can define it, especially in Tidal Creek water, it's the nutrient flows. Are you seeing algal? Do you have metal deposits? Do you have, future issues related to things that have been industrial issues that have caused them today, right? I don't think we have any of those specific issues right now. We're very fortunate in that our Tidal Creek has the ocean right here. So we have 4.5 feet of water that comes in and goes out twice a day. The system is flushed really well. Paper River is laden. But because our system flushes so well, we don't have the same issues with alkaloids, which ultimately lead to dead algae, which ultimately leads to no oxygen and fish kills. We're very fortunate because our system flushes. So we have a lot of natural fortune right here. But with that said, we are influenced by things in the down there, and I teach a class in Philadelphia, where I'm doing a public policy class. And I talk to them, like, where does Cape River from? And everybody thinks it stops at the end of their town, or starts at the beginning of it, and it doesn't, right? From the Albany River up near Greensboro, they come together. So the central corridor of North Carolina is very where on that. And so we always have to be cognizant of, you hear about Gen X and inclusion and all that, right? We have to be cognizant of things happening about the basin, but ultimately it can affect us. That there's, one of the concerns I have, in addition to some field rise are the dredging project here, right? If they deepen that channel, that can also deposit them dramatically in and out of the creek. Maybe that's a good thing for flushing, maybe it's not, maybe it's still anymore, we don't know. But there are some real stretches that we need to be, and they can maybe talk about like the bigger picture, what makes the healthy system, it's, you have to, how long are you looking to it, 5 years, 10 years, right? I think right now, I would say we have a pretty healthy system, because we're fortunate when on vacation, but long term, what makes a makes a healthy marsh, and how you give it a big check mark, right? That's a tough question.
Okay, well, story. So, from what I see, yeah, the marsh looks like, I can't talk about the dolphins and what I think you need is to basically map the resource. And as Molly was talking about, a healthy marsh is a healthy marsh because of two things. One is plant production, and then two is sediment supply. And a lot of that is elevation. What kind of elevation capital do you have? So what that means is that the plant has a sweet spot that it grows in between tides. Right? And so that surface elevation is marsh is critical to help with that. And that's something you can map on the scale. Right? So using sensing, using aerial images, and then calibrating that with some field performance, you can easily map the so that's what I would suggest you guys do. And that's something we have done on other areas.
Yeah, and there's been some work, I'm looking at, so as the marshes get less healthy, the vegetation starts to decline. And it starts to spread out, and you get the formation of lots of little tidal creeks and ponds that weren't there before that start to disintegrate the marsh. And so there's been some work done where there's actually some relationships where if you look at satellite photos, you can say, based on the relationship between the area of the tidal creeks and ponding and the areas of vegetation, this would be considered a healthy, long, resilient marsh versus one that's declining. And I'd say from what I've seen, your marshes actually look great, but yeah.
Yeah, from my perspective, just a few points. What's enlightening today, although I have been somewhat cognizant of it, is the estuary and shoreline, the creek shoreline, and how that relates to sea level rise, because we put so much focus on the oceanfront shoreline and the risk associated with the storm surge, while we sort of put the creek to the side. And that to me is somewhat of a concern that I think we should start looking closer into. And but it's good to hear your all's comments and your check marks on the creek. I'm aware of some siltation that folks have come to the council before to address with dredging in some areas of the creek. And then I'm aware of, so we do GIS aerial photography. So I'm aware of some areas of the creek where the shoreline has migrated further landward, particularly along the marina, the back side of the marina part. But yeah, 2019 was, we did a full island-wide LiDAR set. Yeah. And then one more point, we've had, between Chris and I and Beth have had some discussions on bulkheads and folks wanting to put bulkheads in, or folks putting bulkheads in on the creek side, and how that affects the adjacent marsh area, to the extent that I'm wholeheartedly in favor of other ways with the living shorelines as another option. But today, that's a decision of the homeowner. So that's, you know, it's up to the homeowner. They can do the bulkhead and get a permit through the State Division of Coastal Management to do that.
But that's why the conversation we had, hey, there's an alternative. Is probably available, and that's a critical conversation. And the one thing I'd like to mention about sea level rise, because everybody thinks of the beach. You go down the federal road and you get a really high tide, and the water's not that far below there. Right? And it's not necessarily, you know, a little bit of sea level, you know, everybody thinks 6 inches, not much, but you add 6 inches, and then you add a storm surge on top of it, and all of a sudden, that's a lot. So we definitely, it's great that we have village management that thinks about this, right? It's a really good ways.
Following on what you were talking about with the dredging, 2 questions. Do we know how the dredging will affect the rise on the island of the water? And is there any study that is going to, is there any study to affect what the dredging is actually doing?
You want to talk over there?
Yeah, I mean, they're really, when I say they, between the North Carolina State Ports Authority and the Corps of Engineers, because it's a federal navigation channel to a state port. So they're working together on this. But there is still a lot of environmental studying that has to be done. You know, the State Ports Authority spent a few years on a report that they did. We were actively involved and engaged on that, along with 20 some other agencies. But to get to the answer to your question, no, we don't know what those specific impacts could be because they haven't really done that geomorphological. Did I get that right? That geomorphological study of the entrance to the channel between Bald Head Island and Castle Beach on up through Southport. I think the studies that they've done have really focused on the Cape Fear River northward of Southport. So there's still a lot of environmental studies that have to be done.
Well, and that's probably the biggest risk faced with the interest to push to dredge another what, 8 feet? Right, I mean, that's, we don't know.
They want to go from 42 feet, which is the current depth, to 47 feet.
Water. Aquifer, everything. Again,
But I'd say unlike back in the early 2000s when they deepened it from 38 feet to the present 42 feet, back then there were really only but just a few of us that were concerned. Bald Head Island being one. I mean, our coastal engineer pretty much looked at it and predicted the erosion that would take place because of that. We saw that, so we put the terminal groin in. But this go around, you've got folks all the way up the river that all have concerns and have been a part of that, at least the early on reviews of the early studies that the Ports Authority did, and all that's public record, and y'all can see that.
Yes.
One thing I've heard is North Carolina is one of the few states that still allows gill netting for fishing, and I was wondering, how does that affect the health of the marsh?
This is actually,
Yeah.
letting basically takes everything out.
Yeah, it takes all the bigger fish, the smaller fish don't, they'll go through, but, yeah, it's a good question. That's actually how we assess the function of a marsh is we do gill netting, and so we can see how many fish are using it. But we've removed them immediately back in the water. So yeah, it's a good question because most of the fish that use a marsh are temporary residents. Okay, so they don't really live in the marsh. There's some small ones, little mummy chugs who live in marsh creeks. But most fish are coming in there on high tide to hide from predators and to eat the algae that grows on the surface of the marsh. And then the bigger fish are coming in to eat the smaller fish that are there to hide from predators. So you could have a big effect on certain fisheries. Certainly, if you were capturing everything as the water, right with the gill nets, you put them up, and then as the water leaves the marsh, you capture everything that's been on the marsh surface. You could probably draw down certain fish species, but I haven't heard of a particular species being impacted that. Like, I haven't heard of a fishery being impacted by the level of vegetation.
Does it affect, the sediment and the plant life? I mean, isn't it
Yes.
all connected?
I would follow up with Molly said by saying, yeah, if you remove the large predators, you could have actually control the cascade because of the fish and the larger animals than the smaller. That has an effect on the geomorphology. So crab, pearls, for example, improve that off the grass, called the green sequence effect, all of the flowers. And so we fill the crabs, dig holes in the marsh, and that aerates the soil and makes the plants grow up. So when you remove the large predators, then you have a cascade on the small.
So it's important, like, any major disturbance to any one of those particular aspects has ramifications for the it's complicated because sometimes you can predict, sometimes it's not, but there will be consequences. Sometimes it's easy to see in here. That's why large observers. So,
and we'll say there's already signs out there that says that the removal of these large predators contributes to marsh and erosion. So there's a direct.
We have one more question. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah. Say, Jared, we have some.
Fires. This is actually for silvers and. Talked about the marsh grasses and fungus that we think it is, the orange part is on it. So the idea, I guess, is that's a thing. But isn't it also part of the natural process?
Yeah, very good question. Really good question. So we don't really know yet. And I think, if you look at the marsh, it's not all orange, right? So it's probably doing pretty well. And yet we don't know, and I was talking to Molly about this last couple of days. So why? Why does the marsh die? We don't really know. We know that there are some big stressors involved. For example, if there's a drought, the plants don't like high salinity. So if there's a drought, that is one stressor that we can link directly to the dieback of vegetation. So in this case, we're more trying to predict the future. I mean, what are those multiple stressors that impact the grasses that might lead to that die, right? So we haven't, we're just starting to understand whether there's fungi that might but you're exactly right. It's a good thing, and I'll explain the good part. The good side of it is that it's been shown that all the snails that you see on the plants, right? All the snails that you see on the plants, they're detrital feeders as well, just like I was talking about. They don't eat the plant directly, right? It eats the bacteria and the fungi that are growing on cuts in the plant. This is something that Brian Silliman showed years ago, right? And so they know the science is there that said all the nutrients for that snail come from the plant, but only indirectly through the mite. So in that sense, fungi is good because it nourishes the snail, and this is a natural process that doesn't feel too much. So you're exactly right that it is good. And then what we're saying is, well, what if they turn around and attack and lead to these large dieback stones, which have been shown, especially associated from the plant source.
Thanks. So, thanks again. A lot of good questions. They will be available tonight if you're going to the dinner. I just want to say, I want to plug the Conservancy a little bit. Yeah. So one of a lot of the questions that you asked are really fundamental, but that's why having information before disturbance is so valuable. If we didn't have water quality data in the creek, if we didn't have aquifer depth of water, if we didn't have all these other things that we're trying to work on, maritime forest, if we didn't have that, how would you know when there's a disturbance that has a negative consequence versus what is kind of a natural worried about bouncing back. You don't know. You can't look after the fact and say, well, we know what had happened. It's like, how can you know that if you didn't know what it was doing before? Right? And obviously we can't start collecting data 100 years ago, but 5 or 10 years and making sure we don't know how long it'll be until that information is really, really relevant. Right? We better make sure that we have it and we know, and we can provide people to help us interpret that data. Right. And so we know it's like, hey, look, here's what we saw. We saw nature doing this and did this for a while. And it's like, well, what was that? Right. We may not know exactly, but at least we know that that's different. And we need to think about it and find out what the reason is. And then let whether it's Chris or Peter or whoever's that's really valuable. And that's long-term thinking. It's hard to get people to think 20, 30, 50 years down. It's hard to do. That's why you're having, us around. I think it's so valuable because that's what we're trying to do, is get that information and provide it as best we can. So anyway, that's my plug. Yes. Yeah.
Let me just say, it's not hard on those councils. And if this comes back to your question, Russ, what communities are really studying sustainability and digging in and trying to figure it out? Having the conservancy on board is something that I'm not aware of any other community that has anything like this organization that does this work for us. And inform us about what's going on in our environment. So the federal help with us, I think it's benefited the silence for a long, long time. And we appreciate you for all of this.
Thanks. That's good. We're all together, right? I mean, I think we have folks like y'all coming in the Johnston supporting us with Dept that allow us to do this. So I'd love to talk to you if you're interested in getting more involved or whatever. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.